this meeting. So welcome everybody to the workshop of the Journal of Population Economics, the so-called spring workshop we do normally in this part of the year. I am happy to see lots of people around the globe. Over 100 people have registered for the day event. Well, I'm Klaus Zimmermann. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Population Economics, and the objective of this event is, as some of you know from previous participations, that we would like to give freshly published authors a chance to give their paper in a snapshot to make people aware of what they have done, and also to enable readers and followers of the journal to interact with the authors. So that's our contribution to make the debate about our work more visible. Now, something new after the formal part, after the 2 hours, after 12 o'clock Berlin time, I will remain available for those who want, on a non-formal way, interact with me about publishing in the journal. We have time, at least half an hour or so afterwards. So if you have questions, please just stay online at the end of the session. Now, first I have to announce some house rules. We are many people, but we want to keep the style of a seminar, so everybody in principle can interact, can show the video. Actually, I'm a fan of videos, so if you would like to show yourself, that is very much welcome. Now, it's important, however, that you mute yourself as long as you're not asked to talk, or you are willing to talk and make yourself aware. Now, questions, well, not during the talk. Each paper presenter has 10 minutes only, and we have 5 minutes afterwards for questions and answers. So either write your questions or remarks in the chat, or raise it when the session chair is inviting you. Okay, well, hopefully this will be an interesting day with a morning meeting 10 to 12 and the afternoon meeting between 3 o'clock and 5 p.m. So looking forward to interact with you. Now the session chair is Gregory Ponthiere, and I'm asked Gregory, take over.
Thanks a lot, Klaus. Actually, I wanted to start my video, but it seems that the animator has stopped it. I received a message, so I cannot start my video. I'm really sorry about this. Maybe it's just a problem of parameterization.
Maybe there's something I should.
Yes, I guess it's on your side. I'm really sorry about this, Klaus. But I'm happy to be here. Actually, I'm Gregory. I am serving as an editor of the journal. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
sorry. It was a misunderstanding of a new parameter I have not seen before in my Zoom. Okay. Now everybody's.
No, but it's okay. It's great. It's better to see all of you. So I'm really pleased to be here today and to share the first session. We have 3 papers on the menu. So for each paper, it will be 15 minutes of presentation, I guess, and 5 minutes of questions. So we will start with a paper on personality, and then we'll have 2 papers on COVID-19. So let's start with the first paper. So the first speaker is Uwe Jirjahn, and presenting a paper, Big 5 Personality Traits and Sex. I think the paper has already attracted lots of attention on the internet, because I think it was read about 12,000 times, if I'm right. So lots of access to the work, which has attracted substantial attention. So I let you the floor for 15 minutes. I'm really happy to listen to you. So please go ahead.
So many thanks for your introduction. Let me try to share the screen. Okay. I hope. Does it work? You
Yes,
can
it works
see.
well.
Very good. So, yes, I'm delighted to present the article on Big Five Personality Traits and Sex. It is co-authored with Marta Ottenbacher from University of Luxembourg. Let me start with a brief introduction. Sex plays, let me see, now it's better. Sex plays an important role in the quality of life. For example, a time diary study by Kahneman and co-authors suggests that sex is the highest ranked activity in terms of net positive emotional effect, even though it occupies a relatively small fraction of total time. Sexual well-being is associated with relational satisfaction, relationship stability, and happiness in general. This gives rise to the question of which factors influence sexual well-being. And we address this question by examining the influence of the Big Five personality traits on various key dimensions of sexuality. We provide both an informal theoretical discussion and an empirical analysis. Our theoretical discussion develops an economics-based approach to personality and sex, and hence tries to integrate this psychological topic into economic thinking. We argue that personality is a parameter shaping a person's behavior in sexual relationships. And this for two reasons. First, personality shapes communication and information sharing about sexual preferences. So it influences reduction of information asymmetries and coordination of partners on their sexual preferences. Second, personality influences how partners handle dissonant sexual preferences through altruism or bargaining. Third, personality influences how commitment problems within a sexual relationship are solved. So this is related to self-control, fair-mindedness, inclination to comply with norms, and so on. Our empirical analysis uses data from the panel analysis of intimate relationships and family dynamics. This is a large representative data set from Germany. The data set provides information on the Big Five personality traits, namely openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. It also provides information on various dimensions of sexuality, a person's own sexual satisfaction, the self-assessment of fulfilling the partner's sexual needs and desires, sexual communication, actual and desired frequency of sex, and extradyadic affairs. So, what are our basic results and insights? Conscientiousness contributes to a mutually beneficial sex life and increases a person's commitment to the partner. The opposite holds true for neuroticism. Extraversion and openness to experience, while extraversion and openness to experience help realize a mutually beneficial sex life, we do not find evidence that they have a commitment value. On the contrary, extraversion is associated with lower commitment to the partner. And finally, agreeableness. Agreeableness contributes to higher commitment. However, it makes people more reluctant to express their sexual desires. Nonetheless, agreeableness is positively associated with own sexual satisfaction. And we can look at the results in a little bit more detail. As you can see, we have various dependent variables: own sexual satisfaction, being a good sex partner, fulfilling the partner's needs and desires, expressing preferences during sex, expressing sexual needs and desires in general, the frequency of sex, and extradyadic affairs, infidelity. So if we look at conscientiousness, we can see that conscientiousness improves the sex life, improves person's sex life. It's positively associated with own sexual satisfaction, being a good sex partner, fulfilling partner's needs, expressing preferences during sex, expressing sexual needs and desires in general. It's positively associated with frequency of sex, and it is negatively associated with infidelity. Interestingly, for neuroticism, we observe exactly the reserved pattern. So higher emotional instability decreases the quality of sex life and increases infidelity. So for extraversion, we have also evidence that it is associated with an improved sex life, but it is also improved with higher infidelity. For openness to experience, we find evidence that it is also positively associated with the quality of sex life, and we find no significant association with infidelity. And finally, agreeableness. Well, here it's interesting that agreeableness is negatively associated with expressing own preferences. Nonetheless, it's associated with, positively associated with own sexual satisfaction, and it is negatively associated with infidelity. So these are our basic results, and we interpret these results in light of our theoretical considerations. So then please let me conclude. So while personality traits recently have received remarkable attention by labor economists, studies in family economics have paid far less attention to the personality of partners. Our study suggests that the personality of partners plays an important role in the surplus of romantic relationships. And given its importance for the quality of life, sex has received very little attention by economists. Our study shows that sexuality can be integrated into economic thinking, and we think that economics can make an important contribution to the systematic analysis of sexuality. So, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks a lot for this fascinating presentation, and you are so right on time, so it's really perfect. I guess there will be lots of, I have some questions on my own, but we should first open the floor to see if there are some questions from the audience. I will try to collect the questions. Well, maybe I can ask a small question in the meanwhile. That's about the interpretation of your results and the mechanisms that may be at work. And I was wondering to what extent personality traits could favor sexual satisfaction through improving the quality of fit, we could say, or the kind of assortativity, because really sexual life, it's a matter of fit, it's a matter of good matching or bad matching. And so I was wondering whether, when you look, for instance, at the effects of extraversion, things like that, to what extent it could be a possible mechanism explaining this, or whether you may have reasons to say, no, based on the controls and based on our calculations, we can rule out this particular channel. So it was just a question about the interpretation of results.
Mm-hmm. I think I completely agree. The matching is, of course, very important. Unfortunately, the data set has some information on partners, but the number of observations is so low, we tried it, we couldn't get any sensible results, unfortunately. But I completely agree that matching is, of course, important. And I think some studies show. I think there's one study in the Journal of Political Economics showing that matching is indeed very important, yes.
Okay, so it could be a possible channel, but of course,
Yeah.
that's at the level of interpretations that I was discussing this. Is there, so thanks a lot for your answer. And is there any other question at this stage? I'm trying to look if, so please, you can raise your little yellow hand if you have a particular question regarding some of the results. The paper is very rich, actually, because there are lots of dimensions to personality and lots of outcomes in terms of the sexual life. So I found it really, really fascinating. But well, I don't see any other question at this stage. So if there is, maybe I can ask another question, which would be more about what you concluded. I mean, sexual life is so important for well-being, and at the same time, this is largely both underexplored and to some extent in economics, and also in the social political life. We could ask, okay, what kind of policy recommendations or lessons we could draw, because personality looks like something, okay, it's also endogenous in a way. It depends on the education system, it depends on institutions, it depends on lots of things. So I know that's a question that goes far beyond the paper, because it's about the big picture of policy implications. But do you have some clues about how we could also try to do something to indirectly improve this important dimension of our lives?
Of course, the question is, when are personality traits formed? And probably that is strongly related to childhood. And that may bring us to the style, how parents raise their children. This may bring us to the educational system. And I think, yeah, what we would say is it's a good thing to be to have a high degree of conscientiousness, to be reliable, and it might help if people are emotionally more stable. Yeah, and I think then the question is, how can we ensure this? Yeah.
Yes. I see. Thanks a lot for your reply. I see that your co-author would like to intervene. So please, thanks a lot for being here, Martha.
Yeah, I would like to add that in the analysis. Can you hear me?
Sorry. Could you speak a bit more loudly, because we have difficulties to hear you.
Okay, I'm trying. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, it's better. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. So, hello, also from my side. I'd like to add that the analysis or our results show that communication is an important transmission channel, and this is something that is influenced by personality and has effect on various dimensions, also on sexuality. And this is something we can influence somehow indirectly. And for example, also through education, and to be first to be aware of desires and needs, and then learn how to express them. This is something that could be in conclusion.
So thanks a lot for this. These observations, and indeed we see there is much that remains to be done. I see, yes, we can take a last question. I see by Luca Andriani.
Hi, thank you very quickly. Also, as a follow-up of Martha's last comments, I was wondering whether it's a very interesting paper, by the way. I was wondering whether there could be some sort of a link between some cultural dimensions and the personality traits, in the sense that some cultural dimension might drive a society to push more towards individual communications and interactions, so that people can feel free to say things. And if we educate these people since the childhood in this direction, you might have a sort of on the long run, probably a small impact on the personality trait or on the evolution of the personality trait. And that would be probably with a good positive impact and correlation with other sexual events or well-being and so on. Sorry, it was just like a short thinking now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. I don't know if one of the two co-authors would like to reply to this question.
Marta, do you want to reply or should I reply?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, go ahead, Uwe. I just think, of course, this is how we communicate and how we perceive our needs is strongly influenced by, I think, by cultural norms and where you are raised, where you live, and what's the society and how does the society educate children. Yeah, but please go on. Okay.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely right. I think culture may play a moderating role in the relationship between personality and sex. For example, if we think of gender roles, for example, if we have unequal gender roles, it might be not socially expected that that women communicate their preferences, even if they are extroverted. And so we may find gender differences between personality and specific variables for sexuality, and this might depend on the gender norms within a society. Yes.
So thanks a lot for this nice presentation and all the discussions. Unfortunately, we are short of time. We have to go to the two other papers. But well, thanks a lot, Uwe and Marta, for being among us today. And we are impatient to see the next papers on personality and sexual life.
Thank you so much.
Well, you're most welcome. Now we have time. It's time to go to the second paper. So now we'll go towards, well, back, we could say, to the COVID-19 episode with two papers exploring various aspects of the pandemic. So we'll start with Tanika Chakraborty on economic geography of contagion, a study of COVID-19 outbreak in India. So we will listen to you during 15 minutes, and then we will collect all the questions. So I don't see if I see Tanika. Yes, you're there. So thanks a lot for being among us today. And we are pleased to listen to you for this presentation on economic geography of contagion in India.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gregory, for introducing me. So from something very exciting, from sex to COVID, from excitement to depression, but yeah, so I'll just quickly go over the idea. I think I have shortened quite a bit for this 15-minute presentation. So, so let's see how it goes. So this is a paper co-authored with Anirban, who is also around in today's meeting. And so the idea comes from the fact that there is, what we see around the world is there has been a lot of variation, cross-country variation in terms of the spread of the contagion, right? To the extent of infections, deaths, etc. But when you go even within a country, what we find is even within a country, there is significant variation, especially when we are talking about large countries like India. Right? There's significant variation, regional variation, and it's not always a variation in terms of rural or urban, densely populated or not densely populated. It's much beyond that. So what the previous literature, what we found in the literature, very, I mean, now literature, but in the very beginning, when we were starting this project, it was also a lot of common sense, not established evidence. But typically, the factors that has been used to explain this regional variation has been population density, urbanization, availability of infrastructure to carry out effective quarantine or health facilities, etc., and of course, reporting errors to a great extent. So in contrast, what we do is we offer an economic geography-based explanation. So what does that mean? We say that the degree of contagion, of course, we understand depends on the connectivity. So there is again a literature which talks about social connectedness, etc. So here we are talking about it depends on the movement of people and goods, so mobility. So that is well understood. But we go a step further where we basically say that mobility in turn depends on geographic pattern of regional development. And this geographic pattern, the specific geographic pattern that we are talking about is this core periphery pattern, where there is a core, which is the industrial hub, and there is a periphery which provides labor supply to the core. So there is a movement of people from the periphery to the core, and a movement of finished goods, industrial goods, from the hub to the periphery, right? So in this, so I'll briefly also talk about this theory that was propounded by Krugman, the theoretical background on which we do some empirical studies based on COVID data and nightlights data from India. And also we include Facebook mobility data for analysis. So the rough idea behind this theoretical concept is the following. So Krugman basically talks about this process of economic development, which may end up creating heavily industrialized, as I said, the core area, the hub, and surrounded by a non-industrial periphery, which is the less developed regions. So he's basically saying that if a region, if you think of the bigger region, if that region is unequal in terms of there is a hub and there is a periphery, so unequal in terms of the industrialization, then there is a lot of movement. I mean, it's natural to think that there would be a lot of movement of goods and people across these across the hubs and the periphery of that particular region. So we argue that this leads to greater movement of people and hence greater spread of the contagion. Right? So which means that our hypothesis from this theory is that unequal regions, unequal in terms of industrial development, let's say, unequal regions are more likely to experience the spread of the contagion compared to relatively equal regions where the sub-regions are more self-sufficient economically. Right, so what is the related literature? I think the most important, again, this is a very short snapshot of the larger literature to which our paper connects to, but most importantly, perhaps, to the literature that talks about policy response of governments to COVID-19. Right, so in the pre-vaccine phase of the contagion, the most common strategy has been lockdown across various governments of the in the world, right? But lockdown at the same time, we know. And now very well established that the costs of lockdown, economic costs of lockdown has been extremely large, right? So, so what governments went for afterwards, including in India, was targeted lockdowns, right? Specific regions would have lockdowns, not a common lockdown across the entire country or the entire larger region. Our paper talks specifically to this idea, because the findings in our paper suggests a roadmap of selective lockdown. And as I will tell you more in the conclusion, while we motivate this using the lockdown, but this could be any COVID policy. We use lockdown because that has been one of the most important policies pre-vaccination. So coming to the data that we use is district level. So in India, there are the states, India, and then the administrative boundaries are the states, and within the states are districts. So the COVID-19 data in India was reported at the district level, which is available to us. We construct, in addition to connect this data, we construct a regional inequality index. So this is the core periphery structure, which we are trying to proxy by creating a measure of regional inequality in economic activity. And this we do based on nightlight data. So night-type luminosity data is a very well-established measure of economic activity nowadays. So what we do is we basically rank the districts within each state according to their respective night lights, and then measure the ratio of night lights at the 90th, and the classic income inequality measure, right? The 90-10 ratio. So why this compared to Guinea or let's say the standard deviation is basically because this shows the starkness in the inequality. And that's exactly what we care about, that if there is a big difference between the core and the periphery, movement of people is much more. right? But now think about this, that we have district level data, and when we think of inequality in a region, we need to think in aggregate. But the problem is that if we measure at the state level, we cannot really address state level unobserved heterogeneity, which is a major concern because most of the policies, the health policies, etc., are done at the state level by the state government. So we had to go a step further, and what we did was we had to measure it somewhere at a level which is lower than the state, right? So what we did was we took every district and tried to find out who are the neighboring districts for that particular district. So we basically define a neighboring cluster or a neighboring regions for a specific district and calculate the same inequality measure in that region. Now it cannot be identical because a district would at best have 4 to 5 neighboring districts. And if it has 4 to 5 neighboring districts, I cannot really calculate the P90 and P10, the percentiles. So what we do is we take the maximum luminosity and the minimum luminosity in the neighboring region and construct the inequality index based on these numbers. Right? So what you see over here is the map of India. And these are district boundaries that you see in front of you, and the different colors, the darker shades basically reflect greater inequality, right? And the lighter shades are lower inequality. And each of the districts have a particular measure of inequality, basically depending on what is the inequality in the neighborhood of that particular district, right? And each district would have different neighbors and hence different measures of inequality. So this is to show you our first baseline regression at the district level. So this nightlight inequality is exactly what you saw on that map, that measure, and this is measured at the district and time level. So time for our data is daily, so daily number of COVID cases. And then, of course, I told you that there is a lot of unobserved heterogeneity at the state level, but I cannot, of course, rule out unobserved heterogeneity at the district level, much less so because it is still the same policy, same government at the different districts within a state, but then there could be cultural differences, health facility differences, etc. So what we tried to do was to control for as many possible covariates as we could find. So including, for instance, BCG vaccination, total vaccination, because there was some idea that BCG vaccination might be making it easier to stop the contagion, etc., etc. So because of all those things, we have included all the potential covariates that we could find, and of course, geography and temperature, rainfall, weather, etc. In addition to the state fixed effect and state linear time trends. Now, what you see is that, and what we did was, of course, we did a staggered way of introducing all of these variables. I have only included a few columns from there. But what you generally find is that there is a more or less stable relationship between nighttime inequality and the spread of the contagion, right, across the different variables that we include in our specification. Now, to think, so what we're basically saying is that a region which is more unequal in terms of economic activity is also more likely to be affected by the contagion or the spread of the COVID-19. Well, what is the mechanism? And as I told you already, the mechanism is basically what we are propounding is mobility, right? So two things have to be true. One is that the degree of contagion is a rising function of mobility, right? So mobility affects contagion. The other thing is that higher inequality in economic activity, this core peripheryness of a region, the structure leads to higher mobility. So what we do is going forward, we test that. So the first test that I show you over here is that, so like in many countries, in India also, there has been phases of lockdowns and phases where governments came out of the lockdown. So what you see in these three columns are phases of lock. So May 2020 was lockdown, and then unlock was September. So when the unlock started, September 2020, and then October 2020, it was there were more relaxations in terms of the different restrictive policies. And the idea is that if there is lockdown, there is no mobility anyway. So then the nightlight inequality should not affect the contagion. On the other hand, when there is an unlock, so a normal situation, that is when the night-night inequality should affect contagion. And that's exactly what we find in this table, what I show you over here, that during the lockdown, it really doesn't affect the relationship, but the relationship, we find the relationship working only during normal times or close to normal times. Now, what we do next is more direct test that nighttime inequality measure actually affects mobility. So here we go back to go to the data of Facebook Good Data Project, and they provide data on mobility across districts in India. So we compute this mobility measure from the Facebook data. And again, what we find is that what we expect to find, and exactly what we find, it matches our expectations in the sense that more unequal a region in terms of economic activity, higher the mobility in that region. So that's what the positive coefficient shows you. This table is exactly same as the baseline table with the exact same specification and controls, etc., etc. Once again, the coefficients are extremely stable. So I will, so this is all. So I'll just summarize what we found and what the implications of our findings are, right? Policy implications. So overall, what we find is that higher nightlight inequality leads to higher mobility and higher contagion. Now, our results basically suggest a selective policy implementation based on inequality in economic activity. More intense implementation of prevention policies, so be it lockdown, be it vaccination, be it more health facilities in areas characterized by greater nightlight inequality. Now, if you think about it, this idea of selective implementation of the policy is not novel, because I already told you that there has been, including India, many countries who actually had targeted lockdowns, right? So when it comes to lockdown strategies, it's not novel at all to select regions and not to implement it homogeneously. But typically what governments do is they implement these targeted lockdowns only after the COVID has happened, right? Ex-post confirmed cases basically dictate their policy. What we suggest, on the other hand, is an ex-ante measure that before even COVID has started, based on this particular metric that we use, you can select regions which would potentially be more contagious and hence implement the policies selectively. I think with that, I'll end my presentation.
Well, thanks a lot, Tanika, for this great presentation. And it is difficult actually to exaggerate the importance of the paper. That's a very important contribution because the ex-ante measure, the ex-ante index of future mortality due to COVID is really the kind of ex-ante measure that policymakers did not have at the time of the pandemic. And it was very difficult for decision makers to make good policies because they did not have this kind of ex-ante measure. Now let's see if there are some questions. Maybe in the meanwhile, I can ask my two questions. The first one is about, okay, to what extent you have reasons to believe that the same kind of ex-ante index, your regional nightlight inequality index, could be used in the future in the context of other pandemics? Because I know that this is a work based on COVID-19 pandemic, but we know there will be other pandemics in this century. And this kind of ex-ante measure, do you have reasons to believe that we could also use it for, when facing other pandemics in the future? With possibly other characteristics. And maybe one way to answer the question would be to look at other pandemics in the past and try to see if the same kind of ex-ante index can really have the same power. And the second question would be about policy implications, because the mechanisms you highlight concern mobility. And mobility seems to be the key mechanism at work behind your findings. But if true, then we could think also about other policy interventions more targeted towards mobility in itself. And it is not exactly the same road as the one you propose, because you propose more selective policies based on the index, but we could also target mobility directly, if I may say. So I just wanted to have your views on these 2 points. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah. So I'll start chronologically, so in that order that you asked. So the first question that in other contexts, absolutely, right? So to the extent, so we have to remember that the mechanism that we are suggesting, like you said, is mobility. So it has to be related to a contagion. So as long as it's a contagious problem that we are talking about, then this measure can be directly extrapolated to other situations, countries, times, etc. Right? To the extent that the problem that we are talking about is not a contagious issue, but something else, then we need to be careful about using this, because the mechanisms has to be the same, which is mobility. Now, so I mean, many things come to mind on the top of my head, but then so think of conflicts and other type of situation which is also driven by mobility, right? So but then I don't want to extrapolate or generalize too much, because we have not really explored those mechanisms. Having said that, the question that you asked second, which is about targeting mobility, we are not saying that, or we are not saying specifically what the policy should be. So, for instance, lockdown is a direct target, direct policy targeting mobility, right? Restricting mobility. That's the main aim. What we are saying is, yes, targeting mobility is fine, but if you target mobility for the entire country or a very big region, there are huge economic costs. To lower, so we have to draw a balance somewhere. To lower that cost, can we target in a more selective way to reduce the spread of the contagion? That's all. I mean, it is still costly to even target mobility at any level, right? Because as soon as you're targeting mobility, it means that economic burden on those people or those firms, etc., etc. But can we reduce the cost of economic costs, and at the same time reduce contagion to a great extent? That's all we are trying to say.
Well, thanks a lot for your replies and for your presentation. Let's see if there are other questions. I'm also looking at the chat to see if there are some questions coming here.
Yeah.
So please raise your hand. Yes, I see. Please go ahead, Sumit. Yes.
Yeah. So I just have small questions. Nice presentation, nice paper. I was kind of curious about the role of migration in determining your X, the nighttime luminosity indicator, because I remember during lockdown peak, the small workers were migrating away from city centers, from your core towards periphery, and so I don't know how that changes your X, and then how you go about talking about the relationship. That's all.
Yeah. So if you remember the result that I showed you during lockdown, we do not find any impact of nighttime luminosity on mobility. The reason is we are talking about mobility in a specific region, right? A small region. And the mobility that you are talking about, where migrants going back to their home regions, these are essentially very long distance migrations. Right? It's way more difficult to capture that in the data. I mean, we don't have this kind of data, but even if we had, the extent of that migration is much less compared to the normal migration that takes place due to economic, I mean, basically normal economic migration that takes place over small regions relative to interstate mobility, right? Yeah. So, and specifically this migration, we do not find any impact of nighttime inequality, nightlight inequality on this type of migration. Otherwise, it would have showed up during the lockdown phases, which it doesn't.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, it's already time to go to the last paper of the first session. So thanks again, Tanika, for this talk and for your availability for the discussions. Well, if there are any remaining questions, I think that the chat can be used. But unfortunately, we have to go to the last paper of the first session. Paper by the presenter is Tchuente, Optimal Interventions in Networks During a Pandemic. So it's also a paper about space and the pandemic, quite complementary to the previous one. So please, Guy, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
So thank you, Gregory, for the opportunity to come to this session and share our research. The paper I'm about to present is a joint work with Roland and Jean-Baptiste. It is a paper that is, as you have said, very complementary with the one that was just presented. And in the paper, we express in a creative way our frustration about lockdown during the COVID-19 period. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, government in the world faces a dual crisis, a health crisis that was coupled by an economic crisis triggered by the lockdown that was chosen as a strategy to combat the spread of the virus by most of the countries in the developed world. Why the lockdown was efficient? When I say lockdown here, it was the complete lockdown of all activity without any targeted measure at the beginning. Why this lockdown was efficient in reducing the spread of the virus? It came with a very large economic cost. And in this paper, we are trying to provide a rationale for a social planner who would like to, while saving life, reduce the burden that the economy can suffer. How are we going to do that? We are going to do that by proposing the inclusion in an epidemiological model of an economy where the social planner is going to try to maximize the production while controlling the spread of the virus. The social planner is going to prioritize life by ensuring that the virus does not spread at a level that goes beyond the capacity that he has. That social planner, based on either availability of bed or availability of medicine to calm down symptoms of the virus, is going to pick an exogenous threshold of new number of cases that can occur in the society. Based on that number of cases, he's going to design a lockdown policy that will ensure that the number of cases does not go beyond that cutoff, while ensuring the maximal possible production. In our rationale, we consider that lockdown will reduce production such that the idea of locking down people will come at the cost of reducing the quantity of production that can occur in the society. The question we are trying to answer in this theoretical part of the discussion is to ask ourselves whether that optimal lockdown does exist if we create such a model. The answer to this question will be yes, and we are going to see how the benefit of the lockdown will vary based on the extent to which the social planner tolerates the virus, and also based on who is actually chosen to be locked down. In order to distinguish which agent should be locked down, we are going to consider a model where agents are heterogeneous and the virus can only spread through a network. So in that aspect, we are very similar to the previous paper, because in our model, mobility is going to be also the factor that will enable the virus to spread, and lockdown or other mobility preventing measure will be those used in order to block the spread of the virus. Using our theoretical framework, we are going to try to simulate the dynamic of the different epidemiological variables and see how they behave and get some comparative static. After exploring those comparative static, we are going to apply our model and calibrate it to the US nursing home network. When we do a calibration of our model on the US nursing home, this is for us to enable us to have an insight about COVID-19 for elderly population. Why are we interested to COVID-19 for elderly population? This is mainly because senior population have been the largest share of victim of COVID-19 pandemic. And because this population was the most vulnerable, we think it's a good target in order to understand how we could optimally prevent death during a future pandemic. We were also driven to this empirical application by the fact that in the US, in March 13, 2020, there was a ban imposed to the visit of nursing home in order to prevent death in this nursing home. And the only people who could actually visit nursing home were either workers or staff or technician or people coming to deliver stuff in the nursing home. And what the Project Protect Nursing Home of the University of Yale did was to use a smartphone signal to capture signal of people visiting different nursing homes and use that to create a network of all the nursing homes in the United States of America. Using this data on the nursing home and also other available information on the US economy, you were able to calibrate our network model to 20 US states and estimate the level of tolerance to the spread of the virus in each of these states. We realized that when you have a higher level of tolerance to the virus that we are going to call tendency of being for a laissez-faire regime, you are going to see these different facts. First, when you are in a laissez-faire regime, you are going to see more COVID deaths in the data. And when that laissez-faire is occurring, we also see that the importance of the centrality in order to increase the number of deaths decreases, because now that everybody is free to move, the virus can move more freely, and therefore people who are more central are not necessarily the most affected by the virus. We also, as in a previous paper, noticed that the position of a network in the network of a nursing home affect the number of COVID deaths that occur in that nursing home. And we also confirm that in a situation where the state is more in the favor of a laissez-faire policy, we have a higher growth, which means that the parameter of lambda that we have estimated is actually a fair proxy that gives us an idea of how the policymaker trade life for more prosperity. This is how the rest of our talk is going to be organized. In our theoretical framework, we are going to consider that we have a number of agents denoted by capital N, and each of those agents can be in one of the four possible epidemiological states. It can either be a susceptible or an infected. If he's infected, he could either recover and not anymore be alive. All the total population will give us a number of N, which is the full population. And for each of the individual in our population, the probability of being in each of those states will be noted by the lowercase of the S, X, R, and D. When someone is susceptible, in order to be able to catch the disease, he needs to be in contact with an agent who is infected. in order to prevent infection, the policymakers are going to use a lockdown prescription that will be assigned to each individual in the population. And individuals can only contact each other through a network characterized by an adjacency matrix A that will give you a value of 1. For example, if you have a network link with someone, and 0 if you don't have a network link with the individual. Or it could also be a numerical number that can be arbitrarily large depending on the intensity of the link that the individual have. If someone is put into a complete lockdown, his lockdown probability will be equal to 1. And normally, because here we are talking in probability sense, the probability of lockdown will be between 0 and 1. We are not going to be interested in variable like the effective reproduction rate, because in our model, this will be something that will be produced automatically through the dynamic of the different epidemiological variable. When you have a group of susceptible, someone is removed from that group if he gets into contact with an infected individual and is himself not locked down, and that individual is not locked down. When you are removed from the susceptible group, you go into the infected population, and those in the infected population can either recover or not be anymore alive. We show that this epidemiological model has a solution, and we therefore then move to incorporating the economic model into the epidemiological model. The way we incorporate the economic into the epidemiological model is a bit different from what is traditionally done in the literature. What people will traditionally do in the literature is to create a social welfare function and add in that social welfare function something that would capture the tolerance for the deaths by either using the statistical value of life or other disability coming from being infected. But what we are going to do instead is to adopt what we think is a more realistic approach to say that the policymaker actually does only care about whether he can actually handle the pandemic or not. And handling the pandemic is handling cases. So he's going to decide to put an upper bound onto the number of new cases that will occur in his population. This is done by putting this parameter lambda as the upper bound to the number of new cases. He then decides the lockdown such that this number of new infection is going to be lower than lambda. When the number of new cases is decided, that will be chosen optimally to ensure that the welfare function here that we have simplified to be a simple production function is optimized. We also show that the problem of the social planner that consists of maximizing the social welfare under the constraint of having the infection being limited to the number of new cases being limited to a certain level has a unique solution in terms of lockdown.
Sorry, excuse me, Guy. Actually, yes. I see from the time we just have 1 or 2 minutes left. So it was great to see the fundamentals of the model, but maybe given that we just have 1 or 2 minutes, I propose that you select the main result you would like to show a bit of the intuition of, because there are 4 other papers after yours. So I'm really sorry about this. So could you just select, one slide that you would like to show us, and then we will ask to the people if they have questions or things like that. I'm really sorry about this, but we are time constrained.
No, it's good. Thank you. I was insisting on the model because I think this is the most important contribution of our paper. So after doing this model, we calibrate this model to the US economy. and we estimate the value of lambda using this network that you can see here. You can see that the network is actually very different depending on the place in which you are, depending on the states. So we estimate the tolerance to the virus, and this is a little bit of the distribution. You can see that it's very diverse. It varies a lot depending on the state in which you are. And to test our theory, we then take that measure of tolerance to the virus and see how it is related to the health measure, which here is considered to be the number of deaths. We see that there is a positive correlation. And if we look at how it relates to the economy, we see also that laissez-faire is related to a larger GDP growth. And also what comforts us into the usefulness of this new approach of modeling the COVID or the lockdown is that we can see that Republican tends to have more laissez-faire compared to Democrat, which is something that is reasonable based on what we know about the US politics. And also when you have more debt, those two parties tend to be close in terms of how they design their lockdown policies. So in this paper, we propose a new approach on how to model the economic and epidemiological model of a pandemic, where we assume that we don't want to use the statistical value of life, and we show its relevance by applying it to the nursing home network in the US. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Guy, for this presentation and for showing us the main takeaways of the paper, which is extremely rich, as you mentioned, at the theoretical level, with an economic and an epidemic structure together. So it's a very rich setting. So I can only encourage the audience to read the paper. But unfortunately, we will have no time for discussions here because we're already out of time. I'm really sorry about this. If there is any question, please use the chat. But I think it's time to go to the second session of this morning. I really apologize to Milena for being already late. So I'm really sorry about this. So thanks to all participants. Thanks a lot, Guy, for your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Gregory, and thank you very much for the first session, and to Klaus for making this event possible. My name is Milena Nikolova, and I'm one of the editors of the Journal Population Economics. And without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Andreas Beerli, who is the first presenter in the second session. He's going to present his recently published paper, which is open access, entitled The Supply of Foreign Talent, How Skill-Biased Technology Drives the Location Choice and Skills of New Immigrants. So Andreas, please take it away. You have 10 minutes for presenting and 5 minutes for discussion. I will set up a timer. Hopefully it will work. And please take it away.
Thanks a lot. Let me share the screen. 1 second. I do it like that. And now, can you see, oops, can you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to present this paper here. It's about the supply of foreign talent and how skill-based technology is driving the location choice and skills of new immigrants. This is joint work with Ronald Indergand, who is at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economics, and Johannes Kunz, who is at Monash University. So what we were curious in this paper, now I need to be able to switch slides. Okay, so in general, we see like a boom in immigration of foreign talent. Currently, firms are reporting difficulties when they try to hire and recruit new qualified workers. We see this not only in Switzerland, but also across the world. So Manpower has these statistics that's around 75% of firms reporting this. Whether you believe this or not, it's up to you. But also in Switzerland, we have many firms report difficulties of hiring qualified workers. Now, at the same time, we see a strong growth in immigration in Switzerland and other OECD countries, and particularly of qualified workers, like typically workers with a university degree. Now, this growth in immigration did strongly rebound after the lower years or years with lower immigration in the pandemic. And we see that there's a kind of a long run trend that tertiary education is now the most abundant group, particularly in Switzerland. We have like now newly entering immigrants have like 61% of them have a tertiary education, whereas this was only the case for 21% in 1990. And this is by far outpacing tertiary education among natives, or when you look at origin countries of these immigrants. So that means basically the immigrants that we observe in host countries are like a selected group, and tertiary education is kind of far overrepresented. And what we want to know is like, why is this the case, and what is driving that? For instance, just to give you one more example is like, for instance, the growth of IT professionals in Switzerland, like 50% of that is due to immigration. So 50% of new IT professionals in Switzerland are immigrants. We also know that skilled immigrants often contribute positively to host countries, not just to their firm growth and innovation and trade, but also to public finances. And often they also do not have negative consequences on the labor market. Another interesting fact is that foreign talent is highly unevenly distributed across space. I think Bill Kerr wrote a paper where he showed that 70% of tertiary educated immigrants worldwide are just hosted in 4 host countries, in the US, Canada, Australia, and UK. And we also observed that in Switzerland, in some Swiss cities, like in Zurich, Zug, or Basel, the share of skilled immigrants are much larger than on the national average. Now, we asked ourselves, what is driving this? And there is some existing evidence of that. Like first, Grocker and Hansen wrote a paper where they showed that basically in a cross-section of countries, countries with higher wage inequality between high and low educated workers, they have experienced, or they have stronger stocks of immigrants with a high skill. So they call this the positive sorting thesis, or the positive sorting what they found. Now we also know that computerization has sharply increased the wage premium for tertiary educated workers after 1980. And what we wanted to learn in this paper is how are these two things connected? Basically, we are asking to which degree is structural change in the labor market due to computerization driving the immigration of foreign talent. And we break this down in 2 kind of sub-questions. First, we ask, how do computers affect the regional labor market? And second, how does this translate to changes in immigration, or in the skills of immigration? So first, let me look at the first part. And we do this in the context of Swiss regions between 1990 and 2010. And we basically use a couple of different data sets to look at that. So we study the local impact of computerization. And we know that microprocessors, so that were the basis of, you could think computers, but also like robots. So they became rapidly cheaper after 1980. And we know that companies started to use these computers or robots or automation technology for work processes that could be automated. And now, which kind of tasks or occupations could be automated is very different for different occupations. So here you have a breakdown of the 1-digit ISCO occupation groups. that are ranked by their wage level in 1990. And you see like the first group with the highest wages, they typically have a task like managers, professionals, or technicians. These guys typically have task content that are abstract, analytical tasks or creative tasks. And then we have some people in the middle, like clerical workers or people who work in factories, where they typically have a lot of routine cognitive or routine manual tasks that are potentially susceptible to computerization or automation. And then you have some tasks at the lower end that are also sometimes called low-skill service tasks, you know, like waiters or, you know, people that do food or clean houses. And these are typically a lot of non-routine manual tasks. And we know that the middle group is skeptical or they could potentially be substitutes to ICT. And we know that the highest group of the highest paid group, they benefit from more computers. They would potentially become more productive. Now what we did, we looked at Swiss regions, and we have Swiss regions with a high routine content in 1970 and so Swiss regions with a low routine content in 1970. And we basically see that here is a measure for ICT adoption. We see that much more ICT was adopted in regions with a high initial routine task content. And that's basically our proof of concept that the initial routine task content is like a measure for how strongly computerization will hit these regions. And now what we're doing is we're also seeing that things are changing differently in these two regions in terms of labor market opportunities. Here is a breakdown for total employment. Also, again, for here, the gray line is for low routine regions, and the red bar is for high routine regions. And you see, and this is like a rank, the wage rank of occupations. And you see that basically there's a decline of employment here in the middle. And then there's an increase in employment here at the top, and higher routine regions experience these shifts more strongly. So a stronger decline in the middle and a larger increase at the top. And here is just for total employment, but we could also look at for immigrants, and you see that these things are actually much more pronounced. And we also see these are just employment changes, but we could also observe that for wages. Now, basically, we looked at the first question. Now we want to see how does that affect immigration? And what we do again here, we have a breakdown of different regions, those with the highest computerization potential, those with middle, and then even lower computerization potential. And what we see here basically is the number of immigrants with different education. And we see that the highest skill group here, the red guys, they were the lowest in all regions in 1990, and they increased strongly even in the 1990s, where the other two groups declined, and then they increased even more strongly in the last decade between 2000 and 2010. And so their share increased much the most, and this was the mostly the case in these regions with higher computerization potential that experienced the strongest shifts in available jobs and higher wages for high-skilled workers. So, and the last part of the paper, we also look at the policy intervention. In 2002, workers from EU countries received unrestricted access to the Swiss labor market through the introduction of the Free Movement of Persons Agreement between Switzerland and the EU. And we asked, did this liberalization to the Swiss labor market help or hinder these long-run trends in that more and more talented workers came to Switzerland? And the answer is basically in this graph, where we break down the same graph that you have seen before for EU countries and non-EU countries. So immigrants from EU countries and immigrants that come from non-EU countries. And we again compare low-end regions with high and low computerization potential for these two regions, for these two types of immigrants. And you see basically that the basic trends are available, or you see these basic trends of more and more talented workers coming for both types of origin countries. But you see that these trends are much more pronounced here for EU countries. And we could also shed light at this in some statistical analysis that we did. So let me wrap this up and take some the takeaways from this paper that we see is that what we see is that immigrants respond very strongly to these changes in labor market opportunities. And we have seen that from other kind of papers, but we have not known that this is also true for these kind of structural long-run trends, so that immigrants respond to these strong long-run trends. So what we do in this paper is that this long-run structural change in the labor market due to computerization, they change these economic opportunities for workers with different kind of skills. And this is how they affect who and which types of immigrants are coming to which places, basically. And what we also have seen is that the implementation of a free movement policy did not stop this trend. If anything, it may have accelerated it. So this is what I have to say, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Many thanks, Andreas, for this interesting and policy relevant paper. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand if you have one. Or if not, I will make use of my role as chair and ask you. So my question is, there were other competing trends possibly during that time period related to globalization and offshoring. And so a lot of the skill group that is affected by computerization is also one that is affected by trade, essentially. So you've probably thought about this, but what have you done to account for it?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. That's a very good question, especially, after the 1990s also, there's some trade liberalization, and some people showed that especially trade with China also might have similarly affected labor markets. We control for that in a number of ways in our analysis, and we find when we control for that in our regressions, like for trade exposure, we don't see that that affects the effect of computerization in any way. And maybe one more thing is also interesting. You would think that probably trade exposure was more pronounced had a stronger effect on the manufacturing sector. And we actually see that our results are driven by the service sector. So basically by ICT adoption in the service sector, and that this is like fueling the change in these labor market opportunities, the available jobs and higher wages for high-skilled workers. And we also see that immigrants are basically going to those high-skilled service sector jobs.
Okay, that makes sense. Unfortunately, our time is up. So I'd like to thank you for this interesting presentation. I encourage everyone to read the paper. It's open access in the German Population Economics. Thank you very much, Andreas. And now we have Magda Ulceluse. Great to see you. She's going to present the paper Eastward, Enlargements of the European Union, Transitional Arrangements and Self-Employment. Magda, I will start the timer. You have 10 minutes, followed by 5 minutes for discussion and questions. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Milena. Great to see you too. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. So the paper, which is co-authored with Martin Kahanec from Central European University, looks at the effect of transitional arrangements on the self-employment rates of the so-called EU2 and EU8 nationals. So basically, the context is the following, that following the eastward enlargement of the European Union in 2004 and 2007, the incumbent member states, which we called the EU15, introduced what are called the transitional arrangements, which were essentially a series of labor market measures or barriers, if you will, meant to measure the anticipated quite high inflow of nationals from the new accession countries. These measures broadly consisted of, among others, complex application processes for jobs, proof of suitability, work permits requirements, quotas in certain sectors or for certain occupations, so on and so forth. However, self-employed individuals were exempted from transitional arrangements, which prompted concerns that EU 8 and EU 2 nationals would circumvent these barriers in place, these transitional arrangements, by claiming to be self-employed, which would lead to a so-called bogus self-employment with negative effects, implications, a lack of innovation associated with the usual entrepreneurial activities, and usually precarious conditions for the self-employed themselves. So in this paper, we test whether this has indeed been the case. Why is this paper innovative? There have been several studies before who looked at the effect of transitional arrangements on self-employment, but they look at individual countries, so case studies. So why this paper is, oh, sorry, I did not. This is the first slide. So why this paper is innovative is because we look at the whole European Union in a comparative assessment. This is the first one to really take into account the dynamic that the free mobility within the European Union affords, taking into account basically the existence of competing destinations within the European Union as well. So in terms of methodology, because of data limitation, essentially we don't have data before 2004 for either national group, we actually test the effect of the remover of self-employment, of transitional arrangements on self-employment rates. Essentially, our hypothesis is that if the implementation of transitional arrangement led to an increase in the self-employment rates of these groups, EU2 and EU8, then we would expect that the removal of transitional arrangement, which took place different times for different countries, would lead to a corresponding decrease. So we essentially expect a negative effect of that removal of transitional arrangements on the self-employment rate of these groups. We used the labor force survey between 2004 and 2019 to test our hypothesis, and we also add a number of variables we control which influence both the choice of destination and the propensity to become self-employed. So in terms of results, if this is this table shows our fixed effects regression, looking at the effect of the removal of transitional arrangements on the self-employment rates of EU2 nationals. So our first parsimonious model shows indeed the expected negative effect, but we wanted to look deeper and to look at other factors as well. The second model, which includes a number of control variables, again confirms the negative effect. So it would seem from models 1 and 2 that for EU2 national self-employment would have been a way to evade the transitional arrangements in place, these labor market barriers, and actually still access the labor market of those member states. However, we assumed that, and this is why we looked specifically at all EU member states, incumbent member states, we assumed specific differences between the effect of the transitional arrangements. Firstly, because not all countries were similarly equally attractive for migrants, and not all countries implemented the same stringency of transitional arrangements. So many countries had exemptions in place for sectors which were experiencing labor shortages or for certain nationalities, so on and so forth. So we wanted to kind of show and find out whether there is variability in these results, but we also wanted we had a fairly limited number of observations, so we looked at the varieties of capitalism literature, and we grouped our countries, our receiving countries, according to the varieties of capitalism literature. So, and this is our model 3. It looks at the effect of transitional arrangements on self-employment rates for EU2 nationals according to groupings of capitalist regimes. So the model 3 shows that basically no significant effect for the southern states, whose effect is actually picked up by the generic TA EU2 for the generic TA EU2. But it shows a very strong and increasingly stronger effect for the other three capitalist regimes. So the effect for the southern states is somewhat expected because these countries, Italy, Spain, had a lot of exemptions in place because they needed a lot of labor. So they had enough exemptions to not make it necessary for EU2 migrants to turn to self-employment as a way to evade labor market barriers. The strongest effect is for the liberal states, which include UK and Ireland. Our hypothesis, our explanation is that following an unexpected and very high influx of EU2 nationals post 2004, Ireland and the UK implemented actually a more stringent series measure of transitional arrangements, so that would make it more necessary, or that would kind of incentivize EU2 nationals to turn to self-employment in this case. The Nordic countries' effect is actually driven mostly by Denmark, because Sweden and Finland did not implement transitional arrangements, who was afraid of wage increase and a kind of use of welfare by the incoming nationals. So they implemented quite stringent transnational arrangements. And the last it's the continental effect, which is still negative, but somewhat lower than the others, which is the result of a mix of lax and restrictive transitional arrangements for certain sectors and for certain occupation in place. So if we look at the EU8 nationals and the effect of transitional arrangement on their self-employment rates, we find when we look only at the aggregate, at the entire sample of country, we find no effect, suggesting that they did not use self-employment as a way to evade the transitional measures in place. And we explained that by a so-called diversion effect, meaning that because there were countries such as the UK or Ireland who did not implement transitional arrangements, EU8 migrants actually migrated more towards these countries, which also explains the very high number of EU migrants in these countries. But if we look at the effect across our different capitalist regimes, and the liberal regime is not included here because they did not implement transitional arrangements, we do find a stronger effect in continental countries, which include Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, so on and so forth. No effect in northern countries. Again, here they did not implement transitional arrangements. In continental countries, there is a fairly strong effect, suggesting that indeed EU8 migrants turn to self-employment. Those that still went to continental countries, migrate to continental countries post 2004, turn to self-employment as a way to evade the transitional arrangements in place. So quickly to conclude, there are different implications of our paper, and they can all be found in the concluding sections. But I think I would like to emphasize a couple. Firstly, that the effectiveness of the transitional arrangements as restrictive tools that enable EU member states to kind of control or manage immigration from the other member states was bound to be limited, tended to be limited and variable across countries and over time. But I think so it was not necessarily as effective in managing migration because inevitably migrants use other channels to enter those countries. What I found most interested was the finding that the effects of the transitional arrangements ended up depending not only on the actual measures that the country implemented, but also on the measures that competing states implemented. And this became obvious in the case of the EU8 nationals when countries such as UK and Ireland did not implement transitional arrangements, so there was a divergent effect from traditional countries of immigration, such as Germany, Austria, towards those instead. So this kind of implies that the member states need to anticipate how other countries' policies will interact with their own, and how this affects mobility and labor market decisions for immigrants. Yeah, for the rest of the conclusions, you can read our paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. Indeed, your paper is open access. Well, before people go on to read it, do they have any questions about it? Please raise your hand. Or I have two other small ones. Well, do you look at regular employment, and did that increase? And then how big are the effect sizes? Well, I also, yeah, I guess that's it. I don't see any other questions, but if anybody else has, please let me know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so regular employment and effect sizes.
Actually, that's a very good question, and that's a very good point, because we did not look at regular employment. We only analyzed self-employment. So we only looked at how self-employment increased post 2004, and then how it decreased after the end of the transition arrangements for each country, which was different for most. But that would also, in a way, it is because our self-employment rate is calculated as the self-employment of nationals from the total employment of EU8 or EU2 groups. So if the employment would decrease and there's a relationship there, but we did not look specifically at the employment rates. That would be something interesting to kind of compare and see. We did look at the number of migrants, EU2 and EU8 nationals, which again increased exponentially. Mm-hmm. So we discussed that in the paper, but not employment rates per se.
And how big are the effect sizes?
Well, it depends by country, but for some country they are quite significant. For instance, in the UK and Ireland for EU2 migrants, and yeah, or Germany for EU8 migrants. So it depended really on the countries, which is also why we wanted to do this investigation in a comparative kind of manner to see, because those decisions were affected by the decisions made by other countries, decisions to migrate, the attractiveness of countries. So yeah.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, if anybody would like to ask. No, okay, well, you can think about it, and feel free to email Magda or ask her in the chat. Thank you very much for this presentation, which has also this political economy twist to it when it comes to the interaction of the policies by different countries and the provisional agreements that they made with the new member states. We are now going to move to the third presentation in the session, which is by Sumit Deole. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please pronounce it correctly after me. And the title of the presentation is The Immigrant-Native Gap in Risk and Time Preferences in Germany, Levels, Socio-Economic Determinants, and Recent Changes. And the article is, again, open access. So Sumit, please take it away.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the opportunity. I think you can see my slide and you can hear me.
Yes.
So yeah, so it's a policy relevant paper. We are not the first one to do this analysis, but we definitely improve this analysis, and we do the analysis that has been done several times before with the latest data sets. So that's the contribution, and we wanted to see how the immigrant-native gap in economic preferences in Germany is changing across time. So because immigration to Germany has changed with time in the last few years, for instance. So this was the motivation. The title is pretty long, and I think it's very self-explanatory on what we're doing in this paper. So, and also one more thing I just want to say, that because I'm the last presenter, I don't have to do a lot of motivation of the reasons why we should focus on immigrant-native differences. But anyway, I will do a quick turnaround. So motivation. So as we know, Germany is among the most preferred destination for international migrants. I think it comes third after US and Canada, according to latest Gallup poll. If we just look at the Gallup World Poll, and if we just see which are the preferred destinations, most of them are also economically advanced countries. So one can say people migrate for economic reasons, one of the main important reasons still. And given that there have been different migration flows across the world, there have been, constant debates and attempts to revamp immigration systems in the world. For instance, the way they are looking at it more and more, the countries is looking into the point-based immigration system, and Germany is also slowly moving towards it, where certain migration characteristics and certain migrants' benefits for the host country are considered as one of the parameters for migrant selection. Just had to throw in this Trump quote here. So there is a reason, or there is a constant debate and discussion around this particular topic, that economic integration of immigration is one of the immigration policy aim target. Coming back to Germany and Europe, we know that this region received a huge immigration inflow lately because of different policies, but also political immigration there was from the European refugee crisis of 2015, then EU enlargement towards the east that we just saw in the previous paper, and also newly introduced Skilled Immigration Act. So there are different reasons why more and more immigrants are coming to Germany. And of course, then there is this evolution of the political debate over immigration, and huge amount of money is being spent on immigrant integration. So in cultural integration, economic integration. So this gives kind of policy relevance for this paper. The debate topic here is economic integration of immigrants. We have seen Magdalena's paper on other economic outcomes which are behavior related, but here we are interested in economic preferences. And why we consider economic preferences? Because the existing research shows that risk attitude or risk appetite is related to risky economic and non-economic behaviors, and others show that risk profile could be important for your entrepreneurship and self-employment outcomes. In doing all that, one parameter we have added to the existing literature on the topic is how the role of migrants' cultural assimilation, or the duration of stay. So how these different types of immigrants and the different duration of stays can affect this immigrant-native differences in economic preferences. So what do we do in this paper? The focus is the immigrant-native gap in economic preferences in Germany. We consider 2 economic preferences: risk appetite and patience as a time preference. We ask 3 questions. What is the extent of economic preference gap in Germany? So I will show you a graph later on what we see there. And the simple question one can ask is why we expect that immigrants and natives may have different risk preference or patience, for instance. So one expectation concerning a positive risk gap could be that migration is a risky process and is better suited for risk takers. So it's possible from the source country, more risk-loving people will come in. However, when we come to the destination country, which is the focus of this paper with Germany, things may be different compared to natives. So that's what we will study. In Germany, the existing research, old paper by Bonin, report that contrary to expectation, immigrants report lower risk appetite than German natives. This is very different result, but it's consistent and it doesn't change whatever we do. And that's what we see, what changes this one. Then the expectation of why patience gap should be non-zero. And in that, one can expect that migration is an investment, so more patient people may migrate. And in that case, you would expect that migrants are more patient than those left behind. And then it's also interesting to see what happens in Germany. And this is, I think, one of the first papers, so very late to the party, but one of the first to kind of show that, considering the patience gap. In doing this, as already mentioned, it's a descriptive project, so we are not going to talk about causality here. So the role of self-selection, it's taken care, it's addressed in another paper of mine, but all these topics that are about causality are, and return immigration, let's say recent reductions in migration costs, kind of are not directly addressed in this paper. We do 1 or 2 tests just to go close to talking about unobserved heterogeneity, but for the discussion, we are not going to add those here. Second question we ask is what migrant characteristics and social assimilation may play, the role they play in narrowing this gap, because this is important for policy, I would guess. And the third question, which was the main motivation of our analysis, is whether this gap has evolved. the main reason behind this was that the type of immigrants or the countries that immigrants are coming from in Germany are different. So in 70s it was different, in 90s it was different, and 2015 it has changed drastically. So we just wanted to see whether this EP gap is evolving as new immigrants come in. To answer the first question, whether EP gap is different across different immigrant group, first and second question. This is a simple graphic of showing you the average of risk appetite across immigrant groups and German natives and patients. So if you can see, for instance, immigrants to Germany coming from USA, Iran they show higher risk appetite than, for instance, German natives. And immigrants coming from Turkey, Greece, Italy, Italy, Syria, Iraq, these are like larger immigrant groups in Germany. There we see that they show lower risk appetite than German natives and other immigrant groups. Concerning patients, we don't see much going on there. That we also have different results later on, and there also we see patients doesn't seem to change across migrant characteristics as much as risk appetite does. Second graph I wanted to show is concerning the third question that I motivated earlier, whether this immigrant-native gap is evolving through time. We don't expect this graph to be that informative given the endogenities involved in the question that is asked. However, we see that recent immigrants show larger gap in risk appetite compared to natives. So that's just a small thing. With patients, again, we don't see much going on there. So the data comes from German socio-economic panel. The sample is restricted to natives and foreign-born immigrants. So second-generation immigrants are excluded from this particular analysis, but we also discuss those results in footnote somewhere. Estimation techniques is taking care of the panel dimension of the data, so random effects panel estimator. Dependent variables are defined as follows. So risk appetite and time preference range from 0 to 10. So higher values indicate higher higher risk appetite and higher level of patients. Explanatory variables of interest are immigrant dummy, so it's just a fourth-generation immigrant or not, and to capture the evolution of this immigrant-native gap, we focus on year of immigration. So whether we see if the older immigrants are more like the EP gap has narrowed or not for those immigrants. So this is the simplest way we can catch it, and we do that. The control variables are age, the typical ones, demographic variables, age squared, HQ, female, married, urban, each German resident, state and survey year fixed effects. And then we add different dimensions using the richness of the sub data set, where we focus on labor market status, so all the unemployment, working, non-working, etc. Education, higher educated, low educated, skilled, the type of occupations you are in. Then we also focus on different migration-related characteristics, such as German level skills, German language skills, German identity, migration reason. So we have exact information about why somebody migrated to Germany. We use that, and intended duration of stay. So how if you plan to go back to your country or not. So we add these different flavors. There are a lot of estimates we are estimating in this paper, but that was the purpose of this particular analysis. Main finding is that there is a substantial immigrant-native gap in economic preferences. We find out, consistent with the existing literature, immigrants report lower risk appetite than natives, and risk gap is equivalent of 9% of the sample mean. So this is pretty large. This evidence is in support of all the previous studies on the topic. We find somewhat similar patterns of results if we consider other risk variables we have in sub, such as risk towards driving, investment, career, health, leisure, sports. So there is no difference there concerning the immigrant-native gap. We find some level of assimilation on the part of second-generation immigrants. That is, they go to the level of they go closer to the level of natives in terms of their risk appetite. And yes, they are substantially, so first generation immigrants are still substantially different compared to second generation immigrants. So first generation immigrants have lower risk appetite than second generation immigrants in Germany. Potential explanations, we guess at it. Selection at source may be one of the reasons that Germany is attracting risk-averse immigrants from risk-averse home countries. This welfare magnet hypothesis may be a support of this. Or maybe that more risk-loving migrants just migrate for temporary reasons and they go back as their expectations are fulfilled from the temporary migration. Second important part of results is patience gap, and there we find also a patience gap, but it's a bit more reverse. That is, immigrants are more patient than natives, and the gap is equivalent to 3.3% of the sample mean. We have somewhat similar evidence concerning first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants. So second generation immigrants, as they are second generation immigrants, they go to the natives level, and so first generation immigrants are more patient than second generation immigrants. Then second portion of the results come from what changes this or what bridges this gap. And there we find that being a female, then proficient in German, self-employment, high education, and high skilled means you report lower risk gap.
Sumit, I'm afraid time was up a few minutes ago. If you could conclude, we have to move to the next presenter. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm done. Just one line. Yeah. And older cohorts of immigrants also report a smaller risk gap. We have this distinction between opportunity seeker immigrants and political immigrants, and where we say opportunity immigrants are those who are economic immigrants who intend to stay in Germany only temporarily. So they have very opportunistic ideas concerning their immigrants, and they also report lower risk gap. So there are the smaller hints of where the ways with which we can reduce this risk gap, and not much evidence of the individual level heterogeneity concerning the patient's gap. So that's the main results and the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions since we have one more paper, but I would like to ask everyone who is interested in asking Sumit a question, please do that via the chat. Well, indeed, as he pointed out, this was the last paper in terms of the topic of migration, but we have one other topic, which is intergenerational transfers. Now I would like to ask Simon Markussen to come to the front, so to say, and the title of the talk is Born or Bred: The Roles of Nature and Nurture for Intergenerational Persistence in Labor Market Outcomes. I see that you have already shared your slides. I will start my timer and we look forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present this paper. I will try to do it very briefly as we are short on time. So this paper is written together with Magda Ulceluse, and it's called Born or Bred: The Roles of Nature and Nurture for Intergenerational Persistence in Labor Market Outcomes. And the background for this paper is that we in data observe strong intergenerational correlations in a wide range of labor market outcomes, such as earnings or employment, education, occupation choices, but also in more abilities or health or other aspects of human life. And we observe these correlations for many reasons, of course. And in this paper, we're gonna try to separate between what we can call what I think of as a natural, even very simplifying distinction between nature and nurture. So what is the role of nature, such as biological factors, genes, versus the role of nurture in large environmental factors, such as shared environment, effects of parenting, etc. So we're gonna be interested in sort of separating the intergenerational correlation outcomes into these two factors, nature and nurture. And of course, this paper relates to a very large literature in both intergenerational mobility, for in particular perhaps studies using different twin designs or adoptee studies, etc. And also, of course, relate to studies of program participation across generations. So what to do in short in this paper is that we study children adopted from South Korea to Norway, born from mid-60s up to 1986. These children were part of an adoption program, which is studied also in other parts of the world, called HOLT International Children's Services. In Norway, it was managed by an organization called Children of the World. And the program implied in effectively sort of a random assignment between children and adoptive parents, in the sense that adoptive parents were not allowed to choose which child they adopted. And this allows us to assume that any correlation between adoptive children and their adoptive parents, their outcomes, is due to, so you can think of as nurture. And we then match these adoptees to ordinary children born in Norway and living with their biological parents, in the sense that we find for all these adoptees, we find matches with born in the same year, the same gender, living in the same labor market, and where parents have the same education as the adoptive parents. And we then estimate a simple, I think, was a transmission equation, or relate parents and children's outcomes, and try to quantify the nurture component using the adoptees, and try to decompose the intergenerational correlations into nurture, which is then both estimated both for adoptees and the others, identified by the adoptees only, and nature, which is then the other children only, which we can do under fairly strong assumptions, which we have to discuss and go through and do a lot of testing for. And our contribution, I think, to a quite large literature, existing literature, is that we provide estimates from adoptees just on health-related income support programs, which is, at least in my knowledge, not done before. So let's see, a few details. We use administrative data from Norway covering the full population, and the analysis, the paper is sort of consists of 5 steps. We test for random assignment for adopted children. We match these children to non-adoptees. We estimate several models and test model specification using education, which is sort of a high power outcome where we also have a lot of other studies where you can compare to. And then we estimate for other outcomes such as DI and temporal disability. We do this mainly for treating mother and father's outcome jointly, but also separately. And we do a lot of robustness exercises, which I have no chance to go into here, but you can read about that in the paper. So let's go to the main findings. And the graph to the right sort of displays the paper, I think, quite intuitively. So in this graph, children grouped into adoptees and non-adoptees, panels to the left and right, they are within each of these groups separated into deciles based on parental outcomes. And we then plot mean outcomes of parents and children, parents on the horizontal axis and children on the vertical axis. And then you can sort of display the correlation between parents and children for adoptees and non-adoptees. And in the upper 2 panels, we see this for education, years of education, and we see that there is, not surprisingly, a strong intergenerational correlation in education, years of schooling, to the right for non-adoptees, and to the left for adoptees. And also for adoptees, there is a correlation, but of course, but clearly it's much weaker than for the non-adoptees, saying us something about the strength of the nature versus the nurture mechanism. or channel. And what we then do is that we put this into a regression framework and estimate these relationships and try to decompose into nature and nurture. And to sort of illustrate results for education, we find that nature can account for roughly 70% of this correlation. But even so, we find that there is a strong effect also of what we think of as nurture and environmental factors, estimated only on the adoptee sample. For labor earnings, we find results quite comparable to education. For health benefits, we find a strong relationship for sickness absence, like short-term sickness absence from work, but really no significant relationship for adoptees in adoptee sample for DI, or disability insurance, such that I returned that, and for most outcomes we find a somewhat higher, we call it nurture effect, for mothers than fathers, perhaps also not surprisingly, but that's what we find. Decomposing into nature and nurture rests on a number of assumptions, and there is no time to go into detail here, but for us the most important one is that we need to assume that the nurture effects are the same for adoptees and others. Of course, this is in many ways a strong assumptions. There are some previous evidence we can rest on, but particularly for native-born adoptees, they find that really suggests no difference in the way native-born adoptees are raised to own birth children. But we don't have much to lean on for foreign-born adoptees. We include only children adopted while very young, which I think sort of strengthens the or makes the assumptions less hard, but still, and we also investigate parental investments quite indirectly based on mother and father's employment and how that changes around the time of adoption compared to other children or to the matches. But there's no time to go into that here. So conclusion, we find environmental factors. We find that they do have a substantial impact. We find fairly strong intergenerational links also for adoptees. Stronger for education earnings and sickness leave, weaker for DI, even if precision perhaps is not the best. But still, we find nature to account for the lion's share of the intergenerational transmission, and for almost 100% probably for DI, which also has some, to say, strong implications on how you think about those kind of programs. Yes, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for being on time. We have some time for questions.
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So do you have information about if the adopted children had contact with their by birth parents?
No.
Okay.
Don't have that.
Okay, so like nurturing could be also coming from there as well, right? So like a possible channel. Yeah.
We don't have information on it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Uwe?
Yes, many thanks. It seems that you implicitly assume that nature and nurture are additive, but I think I could imagine that they are interaction effects.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So that's as I said, it sort of rests on a quite crude and simplifying framework in a sense. This has been studied by some other papers saying that, at least indicating that perhaps those kind of interactions are not that strong. But still, you're right. We do that. We are quite explicit on that though. So I think, yeah, but you are right.
And are the parents who adopt similar in terms of their observables to the parents that have their own children, or you make sure with the matching that's the case, right?
Yeah, so we try to make sure with the matching that is the case. That's sort of these adoptive parents are different to other parents on average. They are, for example, much older.
Mm-hmm.
So the matching strategy is sort of the way we try to make them as similar as we can.
And do the effects depend on whether the couple has already its own children or no?
Yeah. So no, not too much, but we go into that. That's actually a part of the robustness chapter. Yeah.
More reasons to read the paper.
It's quite small though, so it's not easy to be too conclusive on those things.
And then we have Isesko.
Yeah, there is data. Do you have data on same-sex couples or just heterosexual couples?
No, these are heterosexual couples only. And the rules for these adoption programs are quite strict, and I mean, this is quite long back as well. So, yeah.
That's why I was considering this question, because at least in Spain, there's limited countries where same-sex couples can adopt from. So maybe that happened also in Norway, and the data that back in the years that you are using data.
But these are only heterosexual couples. That might have changed now, actually, but I mean, this started in 1960s, so it's that was a different rule.
Last question from Simone Schuller. Hi, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you as well. Yeah, thank you for this very interesting paper. I was wondering whether we can learn something more about some factors in how nurturing works, or in the context in which nurturing is more efficient. So do you know anything about the regional context, like the school choice these parents have, or something else about whatever makes nurturing more efficient? What helps these parents, or maybe hinders them to really input in their children?
So that's a good question. I don't think we contribute much on that in this paper, but I think it should be possible to follow up in future work. So it's a good idea. I will keep that in mind and see if we can follow it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, something about the parenting styles. I'm also thinking along in that line of work. Well, all the more reasons to read the paper. There's a free read link offered by Klaus. And now, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Klaus Zimmermann. Before that, I would like to thank, of course, all of the presenters in this session for the clear presentations and for answering all of our questions. And now, Klaus, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Milena. Of course, thank you very much. This goes to all the paper presenters, discussants, chairs of the first part of this spring meeting of the Journal of Population Economics. Well, basically, this has shown that, we are alive, and this is all very interesting. And I've seen lots of these papers, of course, in depth already, as you will know. So I was very happy to see you all discussing and talking. And hope we stay in contact about these products in the future and cite them and bring them to the to life and into the debates. Now, technically, I would like to pause recording at the moment. Well, welcome everybody. Some of you back, others new. This is the afternoon session of the JOPE spring workshop on papers recently published in the Journal of Population Economics. The objective of the event is clear. We want to advertise for your work and get in contact with the authors in person. The house rules are very clear. Presenters have 10 minutes time to present their paper, 5 minutes for questions and answers. Please mute yourself as long as you're not supposed to speak. Keep your pictures on if you can. And if there are questions, put them in the chat either or just at the end when the chair is taken over again, raise your hands or talk as properly. So the first chair, since Myra, she's in Lebanon and maybe cannot connect. I had contact with her this morning. Now here she is, Myra. Welcome on board, just in time. Let me first give Danny because he has to leave soon.
Thank you.
Take over and share the screen and go on, Myra. Yes, and afterwards you take over. Thanks.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen, right? So, so this is a kind of nice little paper, I think, which is I can summarize in a few slides. So the first thing is that we're actually going to talk about what I call chronic distress. And I've worked on this in a variety of papers. And this is really about the tails of the distribution. So this is using 8 million observations from the BRFSS. And we're interested in basically native peoples. No one's really written very much about it. And the great expert on it is the co-author on this, Donna Fair. And basically what we're going to look at is the tail of the distribution. And I think this is pretty scary. And we've seen this since really 1993. And this very much relates and is the morbidity part of the deaths of despair, because native peoples are the ones who disproportionately suffer from deaths of despair. And you're going to see that disproportionately it happens in midlife. So this morbidity I'm going to show you occurs in midlife. And an intriguing part of this is actually that conglomeration, if you like, is the best thing. What we find actually, and I'm going to just go through it, is that actually chronic distress amongst Native Americans is the least where there are the most of them. So in the states that have most Native Americans, that's Alaska, Arizona, Montana, and so on, the Dakotas and Oklahoma, turns out that the distress is less. But what do I mean by distress? And there's been a big deal about whether the word is distress or despair. And this is pretty interesting. Lots of people have tracked the movement of this variable, which is now thinking about your mental health, which includes stress, depression, and problems with emotions. For how many days during the past 30 was your mental health not good? What you see, that variable doesn't actually rise that much, because 2/3 of people say 0. But the question you want to ask yourself is, well, actually, I spotted what was pretty interesting was people who said every single day of their lives was a bad mental health day. And that seemed pretty bad. Anyway, so let me show you the story here. Is actually, this is pretty awful. I mean, this is the paper can really be described in a couple of pictures. Here's the really strong one. Basically, this is not really a phenomenon, especially amongst Blacks, amongst Asians, amongst Hispanics. This is a phenomenon amongst natives and whites. So if you see here, I mean, this is pretty scary. Today, the latest data we have for 2020 is that 1 in 10 Native Americans say that every day of their life is a bad mental health day. That seems to me to be a really big deal. I mean, Richard Layard in all his stuff has been talking about the importance of dealing with this mental ill health thing. So picture one, basically the paper's in this picture. Second thing, in fact, the big story, in fact, with deaths of despair and negative affect, if you like, is that it's actually especially true amongst the least educated, so non-college and especially high school dropouts. The story we find actually is not just that it's so the blue line are natives. The other line is other races, and over time what we track is pretty interesting, that people over time are disproportionately more likely to call themselves native and some other race. And so there's a big phenomenon about, you know, how you classify races. But the truth is that both natives and those who are in other races, particularly often native and whites or native and Hispanic and so on. So this phenomenon, we're talking about 13%. So 1 in 8 say that every day of their lives is a bad mental health day. And the other thing, just to show, I'm going to, you know, really get through and finish in smart order. So I've written endlessly. Carol Graham and I and Oswald and Alex Bryson have endlessly shown that happiness is U-shaped in age, and unhappiness has an inverted U-shape in age. So what you get here is exactly that. Well, I think of this as chronic distress. I mean, this is the vulnerability of those people, the vulnerability to deaths of despair, to drug overdoses, to suicide, to alcohol poisoning. And so this is the story that you see, particularly then the third component, less educated, prime age is a big deal. It's a big deal in all the sets of the literature. So essentially, I mean, there's a little regression there. You don't really need it, but you know, you got 8 million observations. This is the one place where you've got lots and lots of Native Americans. I've got about 120,000 of them, so we can really kind of get to the business. And this is just a couple of the regressions. And basically, what you see is the probability of a native having this chronic distress is unbelievably high, very similar to that of other races. Men are less likely to have it, and it has an inverted U shape, and the paper's full of it. But I think, you know, we can show that the pictures pretty much give it to you. So, you know, that's it. I'm going to be 8 minutes in pretty fast. I mean, I like the idea of something very simple. It's not a simple idea. It's really distressing, and the distressing part of it is that this chronic distress gap has existed for some time, and it's rising over time. And the other thing which is scarily in the United States, I'm just writing something else right now, is that suicide rates have also tracked upwards. So as you have this, think of this as the morbidity part. The morbidity part tracks upward. The mortality part tracks upward. It has the same pattern in terms of who's susceptible to it. It's actually white, prime age, less educated whites, prime age, less educated natives, and other natives. So as I show you, the gap between natives and other groups increased over time. The worry about this is that it turns out that these vulnerabilities amongst Native Americans, and you could see this if you took the BRFSS data, this meant that the natives were highly vulnerable to COVID. And what you saw were two things. What you saw was that there was a huge incidence of COVID cases and deaths amongst natives. The thing we're seeing subsequently was actually being part of tribes was actually pretty good, because the tribes, in fact, told people to go and get vaccinated. So vaccination rates amongst natives and the take-ups were really high. So more work to be done, follow back and see what happened there. But this is obviously a really bad story. So as I said, the chronic distress, I'm not sure that I expected to see that natives living in states where there were lots of native populations was going to be seen. But there's issues which you can't really do, which is it better to be in a place where there's a casino, and is that you know, does that help? I don't know about that, because we don't have that, but there certainly seems to be positive payoffs to having similar neighbors to yourself, and that's actually work that my colleague Bruce Sasserdot has done. He's done lots of stuff about you know, roommates and having what kind of roommate and peer effects. So there clearly seems to be in this literature some peer effects. And as I say, what we also show in the data is that we have lots of other measures that are consistent. I like to validate measures. There's lots of other measures you can do. So you can take daily tracking data from Gallup, and we have lots of other measures on pain and all sorts of other things, worry and stress and sadness. So this seems like a pretty bad story, that Native Americans also have lower levels of well-being than other groups. So as I said, it appears that high despair and distress seems to go with high deaths of despair. But I mean, I've done pretty good, haven't I? I mean, I'm like right on the money. But I want to just show you back to that picture. So look at this picture. I mean, this is the story of Asians. If you look here, very low incidence of chronic distress, very little sign that this thing has increased. But whites, the incidence amongst whites has risen. But look here, look here at this. This looks like an unbelievably complicated phenomenon. But to leave you with the shocking story, these folks say every day of their lives is a bad mental health day. And I think that in a sense, the benefit of this paper is it says focusing on the tails is probably the most important thing, as I said. But if you look at, and lots of the literature has looked at, this is called bad mental health days. But if you look at the average change in bad mental health days over the year, I mean, the mode is 0, the median is 0, and the mean is about 3. But that really doesn't tell you much, because I think this is pretty interesting, that there is chronic distress and we ought to do something about it. And it maps very well into Case and Deaton's deaths of despair. I'm done. Good 10 minutes, 5 slides, woof.
Thank you. So
Myra,
I think,
yeah, it's your turn, Myra. Take over.
yeah, I think we have 5 minutes for questions, if I understood correctly. So please use the hands if you want to.
Tara,
yes.
Hi, thank you for that. It's very interesting. So Franziska Antman and Brian Duncan have a really interesting paper in this same journal that shows that the statistics comparing Hispanic health outcomes to other outcomes are affected by sort of selection into Hispanic self-identification among second and third and later generation immigrant groups. And they also have a more recent working paper looking at selection to self-identification among Native Americans in the US and how that's influenced by conditions such as casino openings and things like that. So I'm wondering if you've thought about how Native self-identification plays a role in your analysis.
well, the paper actually has a section on that. What's interesting, I'm not sure I buy quite that story. I'll tell you why. Yeah, so what we track in the paper is changes in the numbers of natives between the various censuses. And what you actually see are old people disproportionately are the ones that you find, right? So if you look at 70-year-olds, you look at the group. So over time, the older age groups are the ones that you're seeing this rise in self-identification. So we talk a bit about that. There is a literature to it. I mean, obviously, there's 2 parts to this. The part is, do you identify yourself as native? And do you identify yourself as native and something else? But over time, that has risen. And obviously, there's a big part of this story. But I was surprised. I thought you would see it amongst the young, or you'd see it amongst, more children being born. But so the paper deals with some of that. I mean, my co-author, Donna, is one of the great experts and has written endlessly on it. So I think it's an issue. I mean, obviously, but there's only so much you can do. But anyway, thank you. Yeah, it's a good point. And the paper has a big section on exactly that.
So Eva?
Hi, I was wondering how much of this could be just changes in social norm and the acceptability of saying that you had a bad mental health day. I think that's much more acceptable among the white population, I guess. I
don't think it's just that. I don't think it's that. Partly because you can track it against observable things. So I've written 30 papers on this. Basically, what you have is the morbidity tracks in pretty darn well into the mortality. You can do it on all sorts of data files, but I think the thing that just gets me here is the chronic distress rises over time as suicide rates rise over time, and bad outcomes, so outcomes including drug overdoses and alcohol poisoning. And essentially Deaton and Case and I think pretty darn much it's not about just how you classify it. I mean, you can do it in all, I mean, I've done it on 50 other variables. I don't think it's just about how people say it. I think the morbidity tracks to the mortality. Deaths of despair on a rise. They track very well what people say in terms of their mental health. and I've got lots of papers about that. This builds from an original paper I have with Oswald, which is in the American Journal of Public Health, and I don't think it's just about how people say it.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm Hi. Yes, thank you, Mira. Yes. Yes, thank you, Danny, right, for a very interesting article. So I just wonder, because then I suppose that in the US, there has been a lot of stories about discrimination against Native Americans, right, on the labor market, like in life and in general, right? So I just wonder, if you could say decompose, right, that chronic mental health outcomes into some kind of observable, let us say, I don't know, labor condition or employment characteristics, and see, like roughly, right? I mean, how much that can be accounted for, by potential, labor market discrimination or,
Right.
general discrimination. Thank you. Yes.
Sure. Well, I take the view, and I mean, Deaton and Case, I think, similarly take the view that a great deal of this has to do with the labor market, has to do with groups of people being left behind and comparing themselves to others. But I think the labor market is central to this. The ability, if you like, of this cohort of people who are particularly susceptible to suicides, overdoses, and so on, are the group that have been left behind, and they have not been able to enter the labor market well. And if they have, their real earnings have been low and much lower than their parents were. But I recommend my book, which deals with this, called Not Working, Princeton University book, Not Working Where Have All the Jobs Gone? And I think the labor market is central to all of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gotta go.
Any more questions? I think it's over to you, Klaus.
Thank you. I gotta go. Thanks.
Yes. Danny has to go. That's why we had to change. Thank you very much, Danny. Now Tara is the new chair. She knows what to do.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Myra, for the moment.
Yes, thank you. So we're moving to a very interesting session on refugees. I believe in the updated program that our first presentation is by Lorraine Wong. And she'll be presenting on the effect of linguistic proximity on the labor market outcomes of the asylum population. A 10-minute presentation followed up by questions. Thank you, Lorraine.
No problem. Just a second. Can you see my presentation? Yes?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, perfect. And I have a timer. Let's make sure that I can do this in 10 minutes. And I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to present this paper. It is work that was done during my PhD. This is a paper that is on the effect of linguistic proximity on the labor market outcomes of the asylum population. So you can imagine the research question is to understand whether linguistic proximity has an effect on the labor market outcomes of the asylum population. So what motivates me to do this paper? Basically, the economic integration of the asylum population, which is asylum seekers and refugees, has been a challenge across the European Economic Area. And Switzerland presents a very interesting context because it hosts a sizable number of refugees, and it also has 4 official languages, that is German, Italian, French, and Romansh. So that is related to their neighboring countries. And in Switzerland, asylum seekers are randomly assigned to one of the 26 cantons following a proportional rule set in 1988. So you can imagine there might be an exogenous variation there. And they basically need to ensure full compliance only for a very small percentage of population, that is unaccompanied minors, family reunification, or medical cases. So this paper has 2 main contributions to the literature. First, I studied the economic integration of the asylum population
using a precise linguistic index. So previous work on linguistic proximity, they focus on migrants. So this is a bit of a different population. And another thing is that I study integration in a multilingual country. So there's another paper that is about migrants in Canada, but then I actually find that my results are a bit different from theirs. So this graph basically presents the conceptual relationship between linguistic proximity and outcomes. Just to clarify, what I mean by linguistic proximity is the linguistic difference that is between the country of origin, meaning nationality, and the destination municipality, depending on where the asylum seeker or refugee is living in Switzerland. And linguistic proximity represents the effort to learn or transfer skills. So I would imagine that the higher the linguistic proximity, the more likely that you're going to have a better labor market outcome. And I use many different sets of data. The main one that I use is the Swiss longitudinal demographic database, which has labor force variables, and I can use permit records to identify who has sought asylum before. And they are people who are permanent residents in Switzerland between 2010 and 2014, and they arrived sometime between 2005 and 2014. The linguistic proximity index that I use is called Levenstein distance. It's actually an open source index that you can take online. So in my appendix, I have more information on how you can take that. And I also use alternative linguistic measures in my robustness test. I also have a battery of country of origin characteristics and also some canton characteristics. So here you can see a quick graph basically to show the linguistic proximity to Bernese German, which is the dialect of Swiss German, French, and Italian. Well, actually, the higher the score, meaning the more related the languages, right? Overall, I find that the linguistic proximity are quite low among asylum seekers and refugees. But the thing is, I do want to highlight that there are some advantages of using this index. First of all, it can measure the direct distance for any languages or dialects. So you can imagine the case for Bernese German. And also it is an index with the biggest geographical coverage compared to other indices. And also it can match flexibly with different kinds of country origin. So you can imagine Kosovo or Palestine. These can be tricky cases, and these things don't covered in other linguistic measures. So I use an empirical strategy that is a very simple OLS. My outcomes is employment and living wage. So living wage is a dummy variable defining whether or not you earn above the national poverty threshold in Switzerland or not. And the linguistic proximity is my variable of interest. And I also control for individual characteristics, country of origin characteristics, and also time varying canton specific country of origin control. And I have a battery of fixed effects. So I'm looking at the outcome of about 3,000 asylum seekers and refugees who are from 72 countries, and they have sought asylum and they arrived in Switzerland between 2005 and 2014. And I have 4 main findings. So basically, I find that linguistic proximity increases employment, as well as the likelihood to obtain wages above the national poverty threshold. And I did some interaction models, that is to interact between linguistic proximity and arrival cohort dummies or language region dummies. So I find that the overall results are driven by the early arrival cohorts. And I find no discernible difference in outcomes across the Swiss language regions. And I also thought that English is an international language, and having better proximity or higher proximity to English might have a positive outcome, but I find no detectable effects. I also looked into whether or not my identification assumptions could satisfy, because we wanted to make sure that linguistic proximity is not dependent of unobserved individual characteristics, right? So random assignment can ensure that, but after a battery of tests, I cannot rule out that asylum seekers are not different, not systematically different across cantons. And some possible reasons is that Some asylum seekers, they might have left, or maybe they selectively return before their permanent residency, or maybe there's and I do find that there's an underrepresentation of top nationalities in the data, and I cannot identify those who are not subject to random assignment. I also have a look at those who left Switzerland at some point compared to those who left in the sample, and the t-test basically suggests that the sample is positively selected over time. So this is just to be transparent and to mention that I cannot make strong claims that the linguistic proximity estimates is causal to labor market outcomes, but this is why I conduct a battery of robustness tests. And the first robustness test is basically to diagnose the extent of omitted variable bias. So I follow the approach of Tondji, Elder, and Taber, and Oster, and I find the positive effect on employment is likely to remain, even if selection on unobservable is as important as selection on observables. Other than the LDND linguistic proximity measures, I also use other linguistic proximity indices. I also use further controls and different fixed effects, and I also apply different sample restriction criteria, and overall my results are robust. So to conclude, this is among the first paper to examine the link between linguistic proximity and the labor market outcomes for the asylum population in a multilingual country. As you can see from the previous slides, I find that linguistic proximity has a positive effect on labor market outcomes. And the results are mainly driven by earlier arrival cohorts. So this is why it also comes down to this other conclusion is that, okay, we should invest in teaching the Swiss local languages and also assessing language proficiency of asylum seekers. Perhaps we should put more resources into those who just arrived. And also further research can study the channels through which linguistic proximity affects labor market outcomes, as well as other aspects of language in greater detail. Thank you so much for inviting me again. And this is the end. This is my email in case you have further questions. Over to you, Tara.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. You can exit out of the share screen, and then we will open it up for any questions or comments.
Yeah, I have a quick one. I think maybe it's already there in the paper, but do you have actual language proficiencies of these asylum seekers?
Should I take all the questions all at once, or should I answer already?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So in my paper, so actually in the data, I don't have any information on language fluency, but I have a dummy variable on whether or not they identify what is their main language. Okay. So I did use that in my robustness test, and I didn't find that there is a result. There's an impact on the.
Okay, because I was kind of curious about which language they are proximate to. So I think different languages have different returns in the labor market, right?
Yeah, definitely.
German and French, for instance, is different than Italian. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, so just to follow on that, okay. So that is the country of origin language based on your nationality and depending on where they live. So you can imagine if you live in Zurich, then it would be your mother tongue.
Okay.
With German, yeah. And if you live in Lausanne, it would be mother tongue with French.
Okay, okay, yeah, that makes it clear. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Vince, Bons?
Yes, Vince, thank you. Doesn't matter. Thank you so much. I just want to question in terms of randomness. There are several studies in the Danish context. I'm living in Denmark, and they use also the same random assignment of asylum seekers. And what they find out actually that, do you know when they get the slot? So for instance, in Denmark, you have, I don't know, 100 slots, and the first who gets the first 10, it's less random because they can kind of, the agency can itself decide. And then the closer the gap becomes, the less availability there are. So now they claim that if you focus, let's say, on the 50 last slots, it's more random than on the first one. I don't know if you do you know what I see, or what's my point is?
I see what your point is. So the thing is, like, I also mentioned in the paper, what I have is their municipality of residence during the time of the outcome period, so 2010 and 2014. But the thing is, like, I don't have the first assigned municipality or first assigned canton. So there's a bit of a limitation. But I know that, like, I've read the paper from Hein Muller and Hagganer. I think it's in 2016, and they have data that is on the month of granting the permits. And I think having this data is a lot more accurate. I don't have that, unfortunately, but I think in your case, maybe it's also a little bit about like the accuracy of the data that you have.
Yeah. Do you know, sorry, just may I ask one more question? Are they forced to stay for a certain period in the municipality?
Yeah,
Before
so
they are allowed to move?
So in Switzerland, asylum seekers are required to stay in where they are for at least 2 years, basically, during the time that they go from asylum seeker to being a refugee. And most of them ended up staying afterwards because all the social assistance and all the other entitlements tied to the canton. So it makes sense for them to stay as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you for the questions as well. All right, so we'll move on to our next paper on the program. This will be presented by Mohammed Bahrani. The title is Social Integration of Syrian Refugees and Their Intention to Stay in Germany. You can go ahead and share your screen and then begin your 10-minute presentation.
Thank you very much. Did you see the presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so this is a paper co-written with my colleague Sirin Hanafi, who is, I think, also connected. Of course, I think all of you know here are convinced that integration is a very important subject, and for many reasons. And among these reasons, at least the cohesion of society, of course, but also increasingly political reason in democracies, where if there is no integration, you will have just far-right parties that are advancing, but also moral reasons, because refugees are not like just economic migrants. These people have gone through very hard times, and it's also important that they can live in good conditions. So we focus here on social integration and on a special aspect of social integration, with the integration with the host community, because social integration could be also within the community, with other communities. But here it's with the host community, because we think it's really the biggest challenge, especially for people coming from different cultures. And our research questions here are, the first, what are the determinants of the social integration of Syrian refugees in Germany? And what are the effects of this social integration on their intention to stay in Germany? Then we also tackle the impact of economic integration on social integration, and the impact of economic integration on the intention to stay in Germany. And finally, we try to look at the other relevant determinants of the three outcomes: social integration, economic integration, and the intention to stay. So the contributions of the paper are, first, the simultaneous estimation of social integration, economic integration, and intention to stay in an instrumental variable framework, but also the study of the integration of Syrian refugees in Germany, which is a major event in the century, from a refugee's perspective, because most papers focused rather on the impact on host countries, because these papers are mainly conducted in Western countries, and in general, the focus is on the labor market in these countries. We have also some new results, and the main one is that the impact of economic integration on social integration holds only for low and medium educated refugees. And we also confirm some other results that we find for refugees, and which are different from the ones we find for economic migrants. For example, that the negative impact of ethnic enclaves on refugees' economic integration. So the data source is the AAB BMF SOP Refugee Survey of 2016. So this survey is conducted by various institutions together, and it has been used to write previous research on migration. It's a well-known database. The main dependent variables for social integration, we use a mixed indicator, mixing some subjective and objective variables, subjective like feeling outsider or not, but also some objective like the number of German acquaintances or the use of media in German. For the intention to stay, it's binary, 1 or 0. And for economic integration, we use employment as a proxy. So our main explanatory variables are the different individual characteristics, but also religion, because we often think that maybe it's easier for some religion or here religious group, because Sunni Muslim were the majority of Syrians that flew Syria in the war. Family network, but also social network, including the Syrian friends and the number of friends from other countries. The language proficiency, and here we separate German and English, and living in a refugee accommodation or not. So we find, for the descriptive analysis, most of the refugees want to stay. Half of them felt outsiders at some point. And we find that 73% use the media in German. So the method is based on the conditional mixed process model, which is an estimation of simultaneous equations with an instrumental variable framework. For social integration, we use the reciprocity social norm, which is an index from several negative reciprocity actions. This means that if you are insulted, will you respond or not? If someone does you wrong, will you respond or not, etc. And for economic integration, we use the rate of employed Syrian refugees in the same county and sector in the employed Syrian refugees from the same county of residence to catch the difficulty of refugees who was working in a given sector to find employment in the same sector in Germany. So our results, the first result for social integration is that employment as a whole does not have an impact for social integration. But when we interact with education, we find that is significant at the 5% for primary educated and at the 10% for secondary, while it is not for tertiary. And here we think that it's probably a workplace that has more impact for primary and secondary education, like some other studies showed. The intention to stay is, social integration is highly significant for the intention to stay. Now, if we look for the 3 outcome variables for the intention to stay, we find that being single reduces the probability of staying, having secondary education as well, and tertiary, so more than primary, and having studied abroad, but also having daughter in opposition to sons, which has been shown by another paper famous in the literature, that having daughter, you want to come back for cultural reason more than when you have boys. For social integration, age has a negative impact, while secondary education has high impact, positive impact, and education abroad as well. And for employment, being a female, you have less chance to get a job. Age increases. The arrival year is very important. And the other variables are in the rest of the table. So having acquaintances in other countries, you are less motivated to stay. And if you speak English, you have lower intention to stay as well. While for social integration, acquaintances increase the probability. English and German speaking increase social integration. For employment, having a child reduces the probability because you have to take care of your child, because often people are just one parent. The acquaintances in the same country reduce the probability, while for other countries it increases. And the German proficiency and having worked before increase the probability of finding a job. So in conclusion, to sum up, we find that for the main variables that economic integration has an impact on social integration for low and medium educated refugees only. While at the beginning of conducting this study, we thought that economic aspect would be more important, but it seems that they matter mainly for lower educated people. We have this positive impact of social integration on the intention to stay while we don't find an effect on employment, on the intention to stay, except of course the indirect impact through social integration. So the policy implication is that maybe we need to take more care about social integration in any policy, while maybe the focus in the debates is too much. I'm talking about refugees here and not migrants in general, but probably for other migrants, social integration may be important as well. One limit is that the survey was conducted in 2016, so most refugees arrived in 2015, and so it's a kind of short-term analysis. Maybe if we redo the same analysis a few years later, maybe we can find some midterm effects that are different. So it's worth considering to have a second look at this issue a few years after the migrant crisis. And thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Okay, let me open up the floor for questions. I actually had a question. So you explained at the start of the, oh, well, let me let Meyer go first. Go
ahead. Sorry, I was just wondering when you're looking at when you were looking at whether they wanted to come back, I think the first column was, and then
it's not to come back, it's to stay. We didn't have the variable, so it can be to go to another country.
Okay, so for those who were, you were asking them whether they wanted to stay, you actually disaggregated the children into boys and girls. But then for the second column, you just looked at the children, right? You didn't see if there's any differential effect by.
Sorry, I need to come back to the. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so for
the table.
Yeah, for the second column, you didn't look at the differential effect for boys and girls. Like if you have girls versus boys, whether that is going to affect your likelihood of being integrated, right?
Yeah, no, we looked at children. Yeah, because for the other, there was something in the literature telling us that it was a paper by Dustman saying that having girls, so you have a higher probability. But for the other, we didn't look because we didn't have a reason to think that that having girls or boys may help. Having a children may help social integration, but especially if they go to school. So you go to the school, you talk to the parents, etc. But be it a girl or a boy, we didn't have a reason. I don't know if there is something in the literature that may.
Yeah, I mean, I would think the same idea as, whether they want to stay or not. This is about, as Arabs, I could say like, they're very sensitive about, how raising up their girls is gonna be a problem in an environment that is not necessarily following the same culture. So I would assume that also for integration, that would be the same rationale, I think. I was just surprised that you didn't do it but just a question.
No,
I was curious.
Yeah, thank you.
I was curious to see if that also would be, a factor. I would assume it should be, but
probably, yeah. We didn't have this idea, so thank you.
Thank you. So you said that one of your key findings is this result that economic integration matters for social integration for low and middle educated, but not for high educated. I noticed when you presented those estimates that the coefficient estimates themselves were just as large for the high educated group, but just that the standard error was a lot bigger, so that the estimate was not statistically significant. And I was wondering if that could possibly be due to the fact that your measure of economic integration is the predicted employment rate of refugees in that local area. And I'm wondering if for the high educated people, that is less predictive of their own economic integration than it is for the low and middle educated groups. And maybe that's why the standard error was bigger for that group.
Mm-hmm. Serene, do you want to add something about this? Yeah, I mean, I didn't try it, so I don't know. I mean, this can be, we can look at the difference for if the variable was better prediction for higher educated. we didn't look at it because we found that the result would be, I mean, there was some logic behind it, that there is a difference between the two populations, that educated had maybe more opportunities outside, abroad, so it's easier to travel. And there was also all this literature about impact of the workplace integration for lower educated. So we didn't look further. I mean, because it wasn't, it didn't work for the whole population. So it worked only when we did these interactions. And the interactions were to try to find something, because we were quite, we didn't expect to find no impact on employment, on social integration. So this is why we tried these interactions. And when we got the result, we didn't try to, we didn't have your idea that you're proposing now. So maybe worth looking, I mean.
Thank you.
I think that the mic of my colleague is not working because she might have said something.
That's okay. Any other questions? All right, thank you. All right, so our third paper in this session is Haiyan Dang. Is going to be presenting estimating poverty for refugees in data scarce contexts and application of cross-survey imputation. All right, you can share your screen.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Yes.
Yes, and I can see it now.
Okay, great. Yes, great. Yes. Okay, so so I would like to present this paper. This is George work with my colleagues Paulo Vermey, also at the World Bank. Yeah. So as you know, forced displacement or forced migration has become increasingly like more prevalent around the world, and given this situation, international organizations or or the host countries or countries around the world, I'm interested in having accurate and updated estimate, poverty estimate for refugees. But still, because the refugees, as you may know very well, is that refugees are difficult to capture, right? Because they are not often captured well in the standards, household consumption survey. For some country, they can be scattered. I mean, around the country, right? Around the host country. In certain countries, they may be just concentrated, in certain areas. Or in some countries, they may be, living in remote area or in areas that, that are in a high conflict situation. So given this situation, we don't typically, have as much data as on refugees as we would like to have. So that can present, like some challenge whenever we want to estimate, like a nationally representative number on refugees. So given this situation, we propose to apply poverty imputation methods, to the refugee context, and basically our paper, is the first to showcase that a poverty imputation method, can work in this context, as a preview of our main findings, we find that the method, can work reasonably well, of course, under certain assumptions. And we also look at some type of Robinson checks, various Robinson checks to our findings, and we find that the results are robust to whether we impute, for the whole country or to one regions. Here we are talking about, we are focusing on the Syrian refugees in Jordan. Yes. And as a Robinson checks, include, varying the poverty lines, or whether, we can look at like more disaggregated population groups versus, the whole refugee groups, or we can also, and our result also robust to different modeling assumptions. Yes. And finally, we also look at some related issues, for example, whether, like the method can work with like a smaller survey sample size, right? As you know, because sometimes in certain contexts, we may not be able to implement a big size survey on refugee, right? So sometimes we have to do like a small sample surveys. So our method can also work in that context, as well as with some alternative, poverty measures, and also like it compares, reasonable well to targeting methods. Okay, so for the analytical framework, so very quickly, so I can go quickly over it, and I can answer questions. You can or go into more detail if necessary. Yes. So basically, we employ, the imputation model, like proposed in a previous paper in Oxford economic papers, where basically, we run household consumption on the left-hand side on a bunch of household characteristic or relevant characteristic on the right-hand side. And also we have a cluster random effects and the idiosyncratic error terms. And so equation one, we run equation one, like on a consumption survey, where we consider the base survey, right? Yes. And so basically for the base survey, it can be an older survey where we have consumption data on the refugees, or it can be like a smaller sample survey where we have consumption data on the refugees, right? Yes. And then once we have all the parameters from that base survey, we can use the estimated parameters or the estimated distributions, and then we can impute them into the target survey. So the target survey can be a more recent survey where we don't have a consumption or income data for refugees. Or the target survey can be in our context, it can be like a bigger administrative type, like a or sensitive type, like administrative data on the refugees that don't have, that doesn't have consumption data. Yes. So given all the estimates, and of course, we can estimate the poverty numbers, for the refugees in the target surveys. And basically, so for equation 3, it is showing that, that is a predicted, that is a predicted consumption that we can obtain, when we impute into the target survey that, that doesn't have consumption, right? So also because we don't have, the real consumption in the target survey, we need to do some simulation given, the estimated, parameters or the estimated, distribution that we have from the base survey. So basically, equation 3, so like explain that we need to use simulation. Here, say 1,000 simulation, right, to get at the mean or, the variance and so on. Yes. Okay, so so given that framework, so for the data, as I mentioned, we are looking at the Syrian refugees living in Jordan. And so for that, we have a home visit survey with a a survey with consumption data. And then we have an administrative, like a type, database where we don't have consumption. The progress database. And that progress database is maintained by UNHCR. Like they collect data, basically in theory, every refugees, living in the countries. So our purpose is that we want to try to impute, from the home visit survey, that have consumption data into the, progress database. And we're going to run, different, tests to see, if poverty imputation methods, can work well, so that, we can apply it to other contexts. Yes. Okay, so basically, to make the result, robust, we generate, like a 2 random sample, from the home visit survey, and then basically we impute from sample 1 into sample 2, and then we also impute from sample 2 into sample 1, and then we check with with the 2 value, in the 2 sample, because basically we have the real data, we have real consumption in the home visit survey. Okay, so so table 1, offers our main result, right? So basically, if you look at the top row of the table, then basically you can see that we use a different specification, right? Where we bring in, the different, whether we include, demographic and employment variables in the imputation model, or we include household assets and house characteristics in the model, or different variable like a shock coping strategy, right? Yes. So basically, in the end, we try, 3 different model specifications, and our poverty estimate, are shown in the top row. So for the top row here, in terms of modeling for the error term, we use a normal. We assume a theoretical normal distribution for the error term, and so as you can see, for specification number 1, our poverty estimate is about 52.6%. Specification number 2 is 52.5%, and specification number 3 is 52.3%. Right? Yes. And then if you compare it with the true poverty rate that we have, so it is 51.5% at the bottom of the table, and basically is it 51.5%. It have a standard error of 2.5%, right, around the true poverty estimates. And then basically it is so that on our poverty estimate of 52.something%, fall inside the 95% confidence interval, for the true poverty rate. Yeah, so basically saying that like our estimate performs quite a reasonable way. Yes. And then we also try like an alternative empirical like a functional form for the error terms, and and for that if you look at the second row in table 1, then you can see that our estimate hover around 51.5% or something, right, which even seem to perform a bit better than the theoretical assumption for the error term. Yes. And then so that is for sample 1, and then we again we try to impute it for sample 2, and then we also have a similarly good result. Yes. So basically table 1 like give a quick summary of the overall performance of the methods. Yes. Yes, and then of course as I mentioned, we try different Robinet checks. For example, here we vary the poverty lines going from 0% of the population, 1% of the population to 60% of the population like being poor, right? And then we can see that the imputed poverty number, which is the solid green line, they mostly lie inside the gray bandwidth, which is a 95% confidence intervals around the true poverty estimate. Yes. And then we also look at Robinet checks of the result. When we look at the here by case size, that means like the different number of household members, like in the household. So in the refugee context, they don't refer to like that as a household, but like a case, right? Where basically we can have like people like who are relative living together, or people who just like live together in that case like in that unit. Yes, in that like a household type. Yeah, and and the imputation method also perform reasonable well, like not perfectly, but mostly overlapping with the 95% confidence interval around the two rates. Yeah. And then Rieger, we connect to the question of sample size. So basically there is some theory in the literature, right? That
one more minute, please.
Okay, sure. Yes. Okay, sorry. So because we are running out of time, so basically I just go quickly over the sum of the last result is that like given the sample size, some sample size simulation, then we can see that like the result can also work reasonable well for sample size as a small like a 400 or 500 observations. Yeah. And then we also try targeting, right, and and so on, and and the method also like work yeah, I mean the reasonable well. So basically as a summary, as I mentioned, so our methods can offer like some potential for other data challenge environment where basically it's difficult to implement a full consumption survey for refugees. And it also can work if we can say do a rapid assessment on the refugee and then combine it with some kind of census line like data that doesn't have consumption data for the refugees. Thank you. I can stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you. You can stop your screen share. We can open up for questions.
Okay.
All right. Any questions? So I was wondering, it seems in this study that you actually have a very high quality data set to perform your imputations. That looked like a very large data set for the exact same refugee population and context you're able to use to create your imputations. So I was wondering if in other settings, if that quality of data is going to be available for performing this exercise. And if not, you know, what do you have any idea what the implications would be then for the types that, since you ended up with very low error, but you know, for these other settings?
Yes, yes. Yes, so that is really a very relevant question. Yes, thank you. So indeed, I don't have much time to go over the data, but indeed, you know, we are kind of fortunate, right, in this setting because we work with, you know, we can obtain some data from UNHCR, you know, the United Nations the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, right? So as you know, now with at UNHCR, they maintain very good data on refugees around the world. So because they are like providing aid, right, to refugees. So in theory, all the refugees, coming into a new host country, the refugee is supposed to, fill in the form, reporting about, their personal characteristic, education achievement, previous employment, and so on, right? So that database, it's not perfect, but I would say that it captures, let us say between, 75% to like even 99%, of the refugee population, in many countries around the world, especially, like poorer, low-income countries. So in this context, yes, so we are imputing, from a household consumption survey into that census type, like administrative, database maintained by UNHCR. And so we also did some similar work for some African country, which is Chad, which we also have a similar data setup. But but going for work, I agree. For certain country, let us say Ukraine, where we are also looking at the quality of the UNHCR, is not that good. So we are also thinking about combining, like a one household consumption survey with some other, special, like a survey that don't have a consumption data, so that we can provide, more imputation estimate. But thank you. Data is always a big challenge everywhere. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, this concludes what was, I think, a really fascinating session. I appreciate all of the presenters and the audience and people contributing questions. Klaus, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, well, and I hand over to Myra. We are a little bit early, but I think the presenters are here, and so we should go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. So we're going to head to the health session, and we're going to start with the first paper, which is by Bence Bojkovac. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And he's going to be talking about neighborhoods and mental health, evidence from natural experiment in the public social housing. So you will have 10 minutes for presenting and then 5 minutes of discussion. So please, can you share your slides?
Yes, thank you very much. I just tried to share. May I ask in the beginning, can you see the screen and you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to just sum up this paper. This is a joint work with Jene and Cecilia. And just a second. It's not moving, right? Can you see? No, it's not moving.
It's not moving. Yeah.
Okay, just a second. I just stop sharing and try another format. I'm sorry. See if I do that. Okay, yes, now it's moving, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you so much. So I jump directly into the presentation. So why do we care? I mean, it's a well-known factor that mental health issues or problems are key challenges in social welfare, public health, labor market policy in many countries. For instance, it's estimated that globally one out of 4 individuals experience mental health problems. Also, if you take the cost side, then in Europe, the estimated cost of mental health problems was equal to 3.5% of the aggregated GDP in 2010. There are a lot of studies showing the impact of several individual characteristics on mental health. but during the last 2 decades, there are researchers that have been hypothesizing that also the characteristics of the environment people live in might have an effect. And based on that, a lot of studies have shown correlations between, let's say, deprived neighborhoods or the disadvantaged neighborhood environment and worse mental health outcomes compared to wealthier neighborhoods. And I just want to, show you in figure 1 that we kind of replicated this kind of correlation. So we show the concentration of residents between 23 and 55 years old receiving psychiatric medication in deprived and non-deprived neighborhoods in Copenhagen over the years. And as you can see, so there's something going on. So in deprived neighborhoods, it's the concentration increases over time, and it increases, eyeballing says, significantly compared to non-deprived neighborhoods, but it could be also just due to sorting, that people with worst outcomes, individual outcomes that affects mental health, just systematically sorts themselves into worse neighborhoods. So the question is that is exposure to an economically deprived neighborhood a further factor affecting mental health? So we try to look at whether there are some environment factors that also contribute to mental health problems. So what are our contributions? Basically, we exploit a natural experiment in Copenhagen using a public social housing program. And the advantage of that we claim that we account for sorting into neighborhoods. We also claim that we isolate the neighborhood effects from disruption effects. Disruption effects are the impact of moving. So it could be compared basically 2 individuals moving instead of comparing one has left the neighborhood and the other stayed. Then we also exclude the effect of physical and institutional neighborhood characteristics by including local area characteristics and the quality of housing. And we also control for institutional and environmental effects related to healthcare by including fixed effects for general practitioners. And we also look at some heterogeneous effects by gender and immigrant status. So why should we expect that the neighborhood should affect mental health? There are several hypotheses. One channel is saying some social interaction, for instance, greater expectance of drug use in my peer group might motivate me to abuse the drugs or take pills. Or, for instance, if I have a lot of people having a bad day or with mental health problems around me, I might imitate their behavior as well. Or if we talk about deprived neighborhoods, there's a high crime rate. The high crime rate could increase the level of anxiety and the fear of victimization. If I always afraid of being a victim of a crime while I'm walking home from school or work, that could affect mental health. Or maybe also the lack of residence-based social support. It's more applied, or it's more common in research among immigrants, but it could be related to a protective effect of having people around me that coming from the same culture in relation to discrimination on the housing market or labor market, or the other side, that it could help for me to get an economic integration in the whole society, just providing me network finding jobs, for instance. Another strength of hypothesis is structural and institutional factors. It could be that the neighborhood lacks access to mental health care, or it has a low quality of healthcare services, or it could be that the general practitioners, the doctors, systematically differ in deprived neighborhoods compared to non-deprived neighborhoods. They have a higher tendency to prescribe psychotic medication, or, for instance, the build environment is different and it could affect mental health. Okay, I just previous couple of slides ago I mentioned to you this housing program. I just want to briefly mention to you just to see what it's about. So we are using this housing program in Copenhagen, which is basically that the municipality of Copenhagen provides affordable housing for disadvantaged residents with urgent housing need and social problems since the 1950s. Since 2000, every third vacant apartment in the public housing sector in Copenhagen, which accounts 20% of the housing stock, provides housing to this for this system. And the procedure is the following: that if I believe that I have an urgent housing need, I show up in one of the citizen centers in Copenhagen. I get assigned a caseworker. The caseworker evaluates whether I'm eligible based on my story about urgent housing need, my financial means and family size. And the good thing is that the caseworker can access register data, so the person, she or he, can check up on a lot of things that I mentioned. And then if the caseworker believes that I'm eligible, it sends the application to this public social housing office. There is no face-to-face interaction, neither with the case between the housing office and the caseworker, or the housing office and the applicant. And then the office proves the eligibility of my application. And if it decides that I'm eligible, then based on my number of family members and my financial means, assigns me to the basically next available apartments. And I have to finance it by myself. So I have to be self-sufficient in a way. It's not possible to request specific apartments in neighborhoods. However, if I'm a victim of a crime in a specific area, then I can ask for not being assigned to that area. And just this picture illustrates that I go to my application goes to the housing office, and then basically, based on my financial means and family members, I should be quasi-randomly assigned either to non-deprived or deprived neighborhoods. And we look at the outcomes afterwards. Okay, the data quickly. We have Danish register data between 1996 and 2013. We have the full population for each year, so 5.5 million inhabitants times a lot of years. We have data on the exact moving patterns of individuals, housing characteristics, socio-economics, and demographics. We have prescription records. We know which doctors they belong to, what specialists they visited, and what kind of hospitalization they were, what they experienced in the hospital. We use small physically continuous housing blocks as neighborhoods. And then we merge these data together with administrative register of these individuals receiving a housing offer from the public social housing between 2000 and 2007. So we can track people 5 years prior to the assignment and 5 years after. Our definition of deprived neighborhood combines two characteristics, non-employment, which is employment plus those people being, for instance, early retirement, so between 18 and 64, and then income. So if a neighborhood is in the highest quartile of the non-employment distribution across all neighborhoods in Copenhagen, and in the lowest quartile of the income distribution across all neighborhoods, then you are deprived neighborhoods. And the definition of our outcome is an indicator whether an applicant is treated with psychiatric medication, whether the person eats pills, basically. Some descriptive statistics. So we show the means and the standard deviation for all, and then we divide it into deprived and non-deprived. And basically that's first suggestive evidence that our hypothesis of being randomly assigned deprived versus non-deprived is kind of confirmed here. As you can see, there are no statistically significant difference on across the means, across the two type of neighborhoods, beside of family size, which the agency takes into account. There are some, of course, it shows also there are huge differences on the neighborhood characteristics. So as we expected, deprived neighborhoods are on observables more deprived than non-deprived neighborhoods. They have higher unemployment share, they have lower income, and so forth. So we do also a bunch of balancing tests, but I just show you the main one, where we basically regress the probability of being assigned to deprived neighborhoods on observable characteristics in the time of in the year of assignment of the individual eye, only conditioning of the time of the year of assignment, and this is the table 2. And as you can see, there is no, and the assumption is that conditioning basically on family size and household income, no other observable should be significant, or they should not predict whether people get deprived or non-deprived neighborhoods. And as you can see, there is nothing significant here. And I just show you the main specification. So
you're running out
the
of
outcome. Okay, sorry. So basically what we do here, we compare two individuals, one assigned to deprived and non-deprived neighborhoods, comparing them within a local area. No, that's the local area. Having the same house. The house is based on the year of construction, so they come from the same type of house, and having the same doctor after assignment. And the main specification is column 3. So what it says that being assigned to a deprived neighborhood increases the purchase of psychotic medication by 3.5 percentage points when we control for everything. And we do an IV and you get the same results. I just want to tease, then when we look at the evolution over time of the effect, then it seems to be that it increase over time, but basically it's just in year 5 that it becomes significant, which shows kind of a cumulative stuff. And the heterogeneous parties we look at also, just to tease again, men and women, and it seems that women do not seem to be affected by deprived neighborhoods, whereas men seems to be affected over time again. And it shows in year 4 and 5 after assignment that it's significant. And conclusion, I already told the same thing. So thank you so much. And I stop sharing. Oh, no, sorry. So that's it.
Thank you, Bente, for your presentation. The floor is now open for questions.
Yeah, I have a question, maybe a quick one. So I was just kind of curious why this effect should be there. Is it maybe some in these areas, maybe there are more doctors who prescribe more medications like these. So I think this problem is a bit more prevalent in the US, right? Some doctors prescribe medication, psychotic medications very quickly. I don't know if you could control for some sort of, let's say, infrastructure, like medical infrastructure related variables or something like that, maybe. I don't know if you have doctor-specific fixed effects, but I don't think so.
I'm sorry, then it's on me, because I showed that. So I compare people assigned to the same doctor afterwards. So I control for I have GP fixed effects in there. So I control for the general practitioner.
So what is that capturing? Sorry. So
so the Danish system that you have to go to your own doctor first that assigns you to a specialist.
Yeah.
So, and in that sense, so basically what I do is that I control, so I compare people within the same doctor after they got the assignment, just to take into the account that what you mentioned.
Yeah, okay. So it's the same doctor, and just because you relocated to the deprived neighborhood, now you're getting more prescriptions.
So that should be not the case.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's so. Then, do you have any channels like that you?
Yeah. So that's the next one. So we sold out the environmental one because we control for the neighborhood. We sold out as far as I claim the doctor one. So what is left is social interaction. So we look at also other outcomes like unemployment. It also increases in the deprived neighborhood. So something could be that you stay maybe longer unemployed, and through the unemployment you get more depressed. But we don't have qualitative measures for interaction in the neighborhood. We just have in the registers just some objective measures. So that's but all things point towards some social interaction, because we claim that we rule out all the other ones.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's nice.
Thank you for your comment.
More questions? I may have one question. Actually, just a very quick reaction. So is the GP the one who actually prescribes those psychotropic or psychiatric medication? Because I thought that it would be a referral.
Yeah, but that's the referral.
That's the referral. So the GP refers to a specialist, and then the specialist can be different between those who are in the low and the high, let's say poor or non-poor neighborhoods, correct?
Yes, so it's always the GP as a first step, but I don't have the specialist doctor.
So you probably should have, if ever you want to look at it, look at whether or not they are referred, because I mean the prescription is different from the referral. Like he does refer to a psychiatrist, then there would be no prescription. And the other question is the psychotherapy covered versus the medication. Like sometimes psychotherapy is not covered, and that's why they prescribe, because prescription medication is covered to control certain mental health issues, whereas psychotherapy is much more expensive, probably effective, but not covered by the system. I'm not sure how it works.
But it's similar, but our outcome is the eating pills, so the medication, and not that's covered for all.
Okay, I see. And one thing that I'm just surprised is that there is no effect on women, which is usually in the spillover literature, we see large effects on women.
Yeah.
Just I'm surprised that there are no effects.
Yeah, and oh yeah, that's true.
And I don't know if you have medical history, and I'll stop there and move to not to take too much time, but very interesting paper.
Thank you so much.
Really nice presentation. So the next paper is by Olu Abiona, and it's on the impact of timing of in utero drought shocks on birth outcomes in rural households. It's evidence from Sierra Leone. So again, the same thing. I have 10 minutes for presentation, and then we'll have 5 minutes for discussions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thanks a lot. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Myra. So in this paper, we're actually looking at the impact of in utero drought shocks on birth outcomes in rural households. So we're focusing on Sierra Leone as a case study. The main focus of this research, or what this research does differently from other existing literature, was to reconsider the timing of the shock, the timing. So, and in that manner, we try to investigate the diverse pathways by which weather pattern can halt in utero development of children in rural households. So there are various pathways that have been established in the literature, but it was not quite clear. So most times people just explain the channels after they have used one specific weather indicator or weather index. So we reckon that we could do something different in terms of looking at the timing of the shock itself, because we had access to this weather data set from University of Delaware. So, for example, there is nutrition channel, there is disease environment channel, there is infrastructure channels, and as well even stressor factors. We don't claim that we can do all of this, but at least we start from somewhere. So, our contribution to the literature is actually the fact that there is abundance of evidence on short-term early life health outcomes like WAS, stunting, underweight, but there is very thin literature on in utero impact of shocks, especially as it relates to birth weight in Africa. And I'll come to that later. So also we contribute to the intergenerational transmission of effects. So basically, once we understand how timing works for these early life shocks, then we can know, okay, how can we halt the intergenerational transmission of these negative impacts? And like I said earlier on, Sub-Saharan Africa is quite heavily reliant on rain-fed agriculture, especially the rural households. So it is quite important to establish this linkage to be able to help with policy implementations. I think I'll just skip this. So it's quite important for women, and as well, we're trying to distinguish the identified channels in a novel way. So we use demographic health surveys, and in combination we link to weather data from University of Delaware, like I said earlier on. So during the time of this research, there were just 2 surveys that had birth weights for Sierra Leone. Now there is a new survey in 2016. So we had 2008 and 2013. But regardless of that, we had yearly variation as well, as you understand. So there are 13 years between 2008 to, for the 2 surveys, there are 13 consecutive years for around 2,000 women. So the number of birth weights, so the number of children as well around 6,000, but once we link to weather data set, they reduced to around, and rural household, this reduced to around 4,000. So we measure local rainfall and temperature shocks from University of Delaware, terrestrial precipitation and temperature measures from 1900 to 2014. But we do not really need the earlier years, but these data sets are available for the research. So we construct weather-related events for each channel like I said earlier on, we focused on harvests and then contemporaneous rainfall. So harvest needs to be lagged by 1 year prior to birth, whereas contemporaneous moves with the pregnancy period. And that's what we focus on this research. And one prominent thing that we did quite differently from other papers was also, while we're measuring the rainfall, we looked at the fraction of the exposures in terms of what fraction of the pregnancy was exposed to the previous season and the one that is and the remaining part that, so in the 9 months of the pregnancy, we looked at the fraction that was exposed to the rainfall from agricultural season, and then the remainder that was carried forward from that period, because we believe that this context was quite important for understanding the impact of the harvest shocks or the contemporaneous shocks. Once we get that, we for our harvest drought, so we constructed what we call harvest drought shock, which is one, if the rainfall pattern that we constructed earlier on was 2 standard deviation less than the mean and 0 otherwise. So that's quite that's standard in the literature. Whereas for what we call gestation drought shock, which is contemporaneous in nature, so we used from the time of conception up until conception here up until delivery, and we summed the rainfall patterns over this period. So this was unique to individual child, whereas for average drought shock, that was it was cohorts in nature. So that's the reason why we had LYM here, because it moves with the district of birth or residence of the mothers, year of birth and month of birth. So it's very unique to individual child, whereas in this case it moves just by the district of residence and then just lagged by 1 year, which is quite important as well. So once we got the drought shocks from the harvest shock and from the gestation drought. So we had 2 different models which were quite similar, except for the fact that, like I said, this was at the district level or at the locality level, whereas this was at the individual child level. So we included in our model bins of temperature across the period of birth to be able to control for stressor factors that we were not targeting in this research. And we also include district by month fixed effect and year by month fixed effects in our regressions. So our results. So we model, as you understand, as it's quite done in the literature, for birth weight and for low birth weight indicator. So and we staggered our models across 5 different ways, series. And so what we realized is that in utero harvest drought shock relating to the in utero period was actually impactful, associated with reduction in birth weight by around 15%. Whereas once we do the same thing for the low birth weight indicator, it increased low birth weight by around 8 percentage points. We also tried for extreme low birth weights. Low birth weight, actually, the threshold is 2.5 kilogram, as we know. So extreme low birth weight would be around 1.5 kilogram, but we didn't find any result for extreme low birth weights. So that's table 2 for harvest shocks. For table 3, we moved to gestational drought shocks, and we realized that indeed the result was not as prominent for birth weight as we found for harvest shock. So it's simply suggesting something about the importance of nutrition for pregnant mothers. But of course, we still found something which is around an increase of around 7 percentage points for low birth weights. Like I said earlier on, there was no existing result for for extreme low birth weight. So another one important table was we looked at heterogeneous impacts by access to antenatal care. And so because we believe that antenatal care could to some extent mitigate the impact of any of these two shocks. And we interacted antenatal care with rainfall shock across the two models for the bottom quartile. So in the paper, we had results for all the around 4 quartiles, but we focus now on the bottom quartile. And what we found is that the interaction term actually works for the average drought, tries to mitigate the average drought much more prominently than what we found for the gestation drought. So we perceive that having access to antenatal care may have introduced some services to the pregnant women in terms of the need to ensure that they balanced their nutrition, if just in case by other means, or maybe they receive some supplements. We explained that probably receiving supplements. This is quite common in African countries, especially rural areas. So basically our results from the average drought translates to 4% decrease in birth weight and around 59% increase in low birth weight. But for gestation shock, there's around 54% increase in low birth weight. There are no corresponding effects for estimated results for the gestation flood, which we expect to drive the disease environment pathway. And to further reinforce the nutrition pathway, we do not find any impact for out of season shocks, because the season the harvest shocks were actually focused on the seasonal rainfall patterns. So there were months of the year that were relating to season growing of crops and harvest, and the remainder would be out of season. So we do not find any results for that. Our results reveal an interaction for multiple pathways in general, as we see from the previous result, and there is also evidence of risk mitigation for women with early antenatal care attendance. So in general, we make some contributions to the literature in terms of interaction of the weather across the timing. And so it helps to develop comprehensive policies to tackle. So in this case, we believe that it's actually harvest drought shocks that are more impactful and should be targeted for rural areas in Africa. Our findings also provide some robust evidence to support design of interventions, and the main beneficiaries would be rural women in Africa who really need empowerment. Thank you. I hope I keep to time.
Yes, you're on time. Thank you very much. I'll open, can you unshare your slides? And I'll open the floor for questions. So I may have one or two questions. Sorry, I was trying to look at time. I didn't see if you actually did your results by sex. Did you look at the effect on?
Hello. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm Joseph.
Yes. You want to ask a question?
Yes, I would like to ask.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My question is about which method he used to collect the data. Yeah, which method he used to collect the data for analysis.
Okay,
this is my question.
Thank you. So the data set we use for this research is actually a secondary data set, demographic health survey. So the reason why we focused on Sierra Leone was because birth weight data are quite scarce for African countries. So we identified Sierra Leone as the only DHS data set that has birth weight for Africa. And like I said, we used 2 waves, 2008 and 2013, which has together 13 different years in terms of year of birth of the children. So we did not collect this data using any primary method. All we did was just extract this data from DHS, and we link the DHS data set to weather data from University of Delaware.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But as I speak to you now, there is a new waiver as well for 2016 that also has birth weight. So if anyone is interested, they can look at that.
Yes. After all, can you send me maybe your email so that we can communicate?
All right.
Yes. Your email.
There is no problem.
Yes.
All right. I'll search for your details. Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions?
Yeah, you were saying something about sex the other time. You want me to answer
Yeah,
that
did you
question?
run the regression separately for girls and boys?
Yes, we did try to run the regression separately for girls and boys to see if there will be any heterogeneous patterns across this the gender lines, but we didn't find any heterogeneous impact across gender lines, so we had to drop this idea.
Okay, and my other question was, I'm sorry if I was zoning out. So did you look at other anthropometric measures or only just the birth weight? You were just interested in birth weights.
I explored anthropometric methods for another paper actually that has now been published in another journal. So yes, because this framework is exactly the same framework for even Rs and Was and stunting and underweight. So, but this it would be too cumbersome to have these two ideas in the same paper. So then I shifted that to another paper. And the results were quite amazing as well, quite striking as well.
And have you tried any other kind of human capital outcomes? I assume that you don't necessarily want to focus, you could focus on the children, but then also, I mean, the same data can be used to see any other types of human capital. I don't know if you have anything about
maybe that's something I need to, yes, thank you so much for that. Maybe that's something I need to explore, except that the DHS does not have much data on children education, unfortunately.
Okay.
So there probably will be other things that we could
maybe
explore. So what I'm currently thinking as we speak now is maybe some adulthood outcomes as well, emerging from the timing of the early life shock, because the timing has not been explored in depth as we did here, in terms of looking at how they interact in terms of say harvest, which underlies nutrition, and contemporaneous weather shock. Thank you so much. I probably would go back to DHS and see if there could be something we could do more. Thank you.
I think Klaus has a question.
Also, use the chance I have you to get your view on a more general question, which is related to your work, but is not so specific. Now, the issue is weather shock is nice because, in a sense, nice because we think it's exogenous, yes, and on the other hand, there might be direct effects of weather shocks on health, yes, affecting. That's maybe something for biologists or doctors or whatever. The other issue is it has, of course, lots of effects on economic conditions, yes, income or, I mean, financial situation, etc. And it's very difficult to work out the channels, yes. How do you see the chances, I mean, in your context, to differentiate what is a direct or what is an indirect effect?
It is difficult. So to disentangle, and that's the reason why we do not blame the papers that precede our paper in terms of explaining the transmission effects clearly. So many of the papers just lump up the channels to say, okay, it could be nutrition, it could be disease environment. So, but we are just taking the very first step to start to disentangle these impacts. So it is very difficult. Even as we speak now, it is still, our effect also overlaps. It overlaps. Even the contemporaneous impact overlaps with the harvest pathway as well. So it is really, really difficult, but we believe that this is the first step. So as time goes by, as we have more thoughts on this, we probably will be able to even look at. So our intention, we started by actually looking at the harvest shock. then looking at water scarcity, and then flood, because we believe that flood would lead to some disease environment, especially due to infrastructural deficits in African countries. But we didn't find any flood patterns from the weather, from the rainfall patterns, which is why we couldn't explore that. So one step forward would be, okay, to look at flood as well, and then maybe also look at stressor factor, direct stress, just like you said, and that will be linked directly to temperature. So this way, we would continue to expand these pathways, and then we can continue to say, okay, these are the ones that are more impactful, these are less impactful, so policy guidelines should focus on the more impactful ones.
Well, theoretically, I mean, if you could do a controlled experiment, one could, of course, somehow compensate people from the income effect, yes, and then see what goes on. But in practice, this is very difficult to do.
Yes, exactly. It is just, yeah, it's just because most of these overlap. That's the main concern. So they overlap a lot. So even temperature would have some simultaneous effect with the rainfall patterns, which is why we controlled for it in this paper. So it is quite difficult. It took a lot of effort and time to think through just these two channels. But I believe, like I said earlier on, this is the first step in understanding the different pathways of weather patterns on different outcomes, economic outcomes, labor outcomes. Like Maya said, we could do even labor and even adulthood outcomes with this same method.
Sorry again. I would like, can I go ahead? Yes.
Yes, please.
Actually, this paper is very interesting, and I was thinking about if you do not mind about some endogenous variables to our model. Is there any endogenous you think about endogenous variable?
So we used all the household individual attributes from both parents, I mean, as control variables. So we used age, mother's educational background, labor force participation, and the same variables for fathers as well. And we used a lot of household level variables, including income level, household aid, and other stuff like that. So we are limited, as you understand, by what the variables that are obtainable from DHS, but we did include a large area of control variables in our models. Sorry, I couldn't explain that because of our time limitation.
I'm sorry,
Yes,
but my
you.
internet connection is kind of unstable. Just to let you know in case I disappear. More questions? I turn it over to Klaus.
Yes, thank you very much. Basically, we consumed all the time we had, so at least planned. Thank you very much for another very lively and good session. So the afternoon was as successful as the morning. I have to thank everybody who joined us, and I think it's a promising approach to deal with research output in addition to the usual channels we have. Thank you very much for helping us to give the journal and the articles profile. Now I first have now to stop recording.